Olá, boa noite a todas e todos. Nós vamos dar início, então, e prosseguimento com o nosso segundo Seminário Internacional de Direito Internacional Crítico. Agora pela noite nós vamos acompanhar o segundo painel do dia, que é Análises, Terceiro, Mundistas de Direito Internacional. E para compor a mesa, então, desse painel, eu convido a coordenadora do painel, a professora doutora Tatiana Skeff. Now I invited Professor Okafor to join our table. Please take your seat. E agora eu convido para compor a nossa mesa a professora doutora Fábia Carvalho. Com a nossa mesa completa, então, nós vamos dar início à nossa noite e a palavra está com a professora Tatiana Cardoso Skeff. Obrigada.
Muito obrigada. Boa noite a todas e todos. Imenso prazer ver esse auditório aqui bastante cheio para que possamos ouvir um pouco da palavra do Direito Internacional Crítico, das abordagens terceiro-mundistas de Direito Internacional, o que é bastante gratificante. Antes de eu fazer a passagem da palavra para o professor, gostaria só de salientar aqui alguns pontos, agradecer imensamente o apoio não só dos nossos extensionistas da AGESIR, que estão ajudando no evento, na pessoa da Isabela, mas também agradecer a presença dos integrantes do nosso grupo de Direito Internacional Crítico, que vem de diversos estados do Brasil, o que é bastante significativo na medida em que estamos ainda nos recuperando da pandemia e é um primeiro evento que nós fazemos de maneira presencial, né? O primeiro foi online. Então, agradeço aqui a presença da Nádia, que fez a abertura agora do painel e também pela manhã, do Derek, do Gabriel Santiago, não apenas isso, da Bianca, da Thaís, da Isabela Ambo também, e agradeço imensamente a todas e todos, mesmo a Letícia também, que está aqui, perdão, que vieram desde, às vezes, um pouco pertinho, Montes Claros, Pouso Alegre, outros bastante longe, né, Paraná e Rio Grande do Sul. E também agradecer imensamente aqui a presença do professor Gabriel Damasceno, meu coordenador do Direito Internacional Crítico, pós-doutorando aqui na Universidade Federal de Uberlândia também, o que é bastante interessante. Bom, sem mais delongas, agradecendo, I will ask now Professor Okafor for him to start his presentation and say it is a great pleasure to have you here. It is an honor to have a person with such an experience on third world approaches to international law. We feel really honored to have your presence here. It is his first time in Brazil, so it is really nice. And we truly hope you'll come back soon. Thank you, Professor. You have another word.
Thank you so much, Swift. I hope I'm pronouncing that well. It's a shame that I don't speak Portuguese, so I have to bore you with my English. Don't worry, it's just a mere product of colonialism, which is crumbling to the center slowly. I must say that I'm extremely pleased to be here. I've wanted to come to Brazil since I was a kid, because I used to watch Pelé every day, every single day. I'm Nigerian originally, and we're soccer mad, right? Soccer crazy. So, in fact, if you don't play soccer, there's something wrong with you. Of course, there's nothing wrong with you, but, you know, that's just the way it is. So, so this is almost like a dream come true. Thank you so much to for all the organizers, to all of you, and thank you for spending your evening. You know, professors can be boring, so for you to spend Friday evening. I know what I used to do on Friday night. I won't mention. Huh? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? Okay. We're going to talk a little bit of serious stuff. So I'm Nigerian, so we joke about everything. So we always start with a joke. My students are always surprised about how many jokes I tell every line. But I think it's quite an effective way to teach. So today I'm going to...
I can pass it. Do you want to?
Okay. I can try.
Just
Thank you.
point to them.
Okay. Right. So I'm going to... wonderful. Have a few reflections on the future of TWIL, which is short for Third World Approaches to International Law. I know there are many TWIL veterans here who know a lot about TWIL, but I suspected that some might not. So before I get to my actual reflections, I'm going to say something or two about what TWIL is, you know, and what I'm really proud of is what TWIL has accomplished, because when Judge Galindo is not here, but he doesn't like 201 and 2, but that's a rough historical sketch when people in the 60s and 70s did 12 and then they stopped, you know, along with the onset of neoliberalism and all that. There had to be a revival around the 90s, 97. I was still doing my PhD. And when we gathered at Harvard University and said we need to start a movement, we were PhD students. We were starry-eyed students. We had no idea, I tell you, no idea what we will accomplish. So I'm really so proud of it. When I look back, not at what I have accomplished or anybody else that I know, but what the young people today have done with TWIL is really amazing. And you see that as I go along. So, oh, it's on, okay. Okay, so this is sort of the outline of my presentation. What is TWIL? I'll give a brief refresher, hopefully quick, and then one or two about TWIL accomplishments briefly, because we could spend all night on that. It's my favorite topic. And then I'll offer some reflections on the future of TWIL. Okay. All right. So perhaps I should just face here. Not need to be rude. So I know when to turn to the next slide. So TWIL, of course, is short for Third World Approaches to International Law. Three keywords, right? That's one way to understand it. The Third World, which some call the Global South. Younger people keep advising me that Third World is so over. We don't agree. We keep debating. Sujit, who's not all that young, debates that with me all the time. Sujit Xavier, my former student, who's now a big professor. Approaches, so the plural. And I'll come back to that. And of course, international law, of course, you can problematize that. There are notions of transnational law. The late, great Brazilian judge, and I say great with an emphasis, Trinidad, I would have met personally before his unfortunate death, proposed a new jus gentium rooted in people, actual peoples, which TWIL emphasizes, and so on. So quickly, what is the Third World? Because that also, in a sense, connects to what TWIL is, right? If it's Third World Approaches, we need to know what the Third World is, if at all there is a Third World. So my own teacher, the great Carrie Nicholson, daughter of Bolivia, used a famous phrase in her 1998 article. I was just finishing my PhD when that article appeared. Very definitive paper called Rhetoric and Rage, sort of, capturing what TWIL, they used to talk about TWIL scholars about, which is the Third World is a chorus of voices. It's like, you are in a choir, you have alto, soprano, you have different pitches, but it blends harmoniously into one song, right? So that was a response to people who said, there's too much diversity. What connects Brazil and Nigeria? Different. Well, Bahia connects us, but that's a wholly different thing. But today, what connects us? That's a very good, I use it everywhere, not just because she's my teacher, but because of a very powerful way of simply illustrating that what I've called in my own paper as a fragmented unity. Even an atom is a fragment. And you know how tiny an atom is, you can't even see it, but it's still composed of many different parts. That's how to think of it. Balakrishnan Rajagopal says, however, twirl is not inflexibly moored. You know, like, you know, a ship, as the anchor stays one place, it doesn't move. It's not inflexible. There's no fixed, unchanging geography, which is true. However, I'll go to Pendra Bakshi, the great Indian twill scholar of the first generation, who tells us, and teaches us really, that there are geographies of injustice. There are geographies of injustice. Even though there's no fixed geographical space, it can move, you can join, you can leave, perhaps, but there are geographies at any point in time. You can have a geography of where people are being dispossessed, disadvantaged, dominated, right? So that is important. It's not completely flexible. So there is a certain compass which allows us to navigate and see where, stop at third world ports or shores, if you like. And there is a cement that binds, which is a broadly shared experience of being subordinated historically, of being dispossessed, and of suffering serious advantage in contemporary international law. That is, and I use broad because in the sort of detail, it may differ, the exact forms may differ, but at a certain level of abstraction, it's a broadly shared experience. And that's why China is a superpower, but if you have been empirical at the UN, they vote lockstep with the G77 on almost anything, including supporting sometimes positions that you wonder, why are they supporting this? It's not to their trade advantage, because they understand. It's the same reason Irish are attracted to twirl, because they have a history of subordination at the hands of the English. They understand the twirl experience. So the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, former President of Ireland, said this herself. What? Okay, she understood what the third world says. How come we're always being disadvantaged by international law? Because she has a historical memory of that. Okay, but ultimately, third world is by self-identification, right? You self-identify, but that self-identification is driven, shaped by all these factors, by these historical experience that I'm talking about. That's what drives people to join. There's no register, but that's what drives people to say, we are third world, we want to go to Bandung, we want to join the G77 or not. It is you identify yourself, but it is shaped by that historical experience of domination, subordination. So that's why you have weird stuff, like I saw in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, some years ago before the pandemic. Every motion, G77 and China, every single motion at the South-South Summit in 2019, every single, why? Right? You have to start asking that as an empirical question. Why? Okay? That's what drives that. But there is a South within the North. There is a North of indigenous peoples, subordinated, even more so in some respects. And there's a North within the South. There's a transnational capitalist class that live like the North, act like the North. You know, the Marxists used to call them compradors, but B.S. Chimney, the great Indian scholar, calls them the transnational capitalist class. They look like, you know, anyone, live like, behave like many sort of northern capitalists and so on. So there is complexity here, but my takeaway point is that even though there is complexity, there is also significant clarity. In other words, and that's what Terry Nicholson taught me. There is significant clarity. We can tell more or less. There's nothing you know with absolute certainty. There's no border that is defined down to the atom. There is enough certainty that you can tell. Oh, Nobody I can tell you knows exactly where Brazil ends, right? On every border. Well, you know that Brazil exists and has a border. That's enough for me, okay? Okay, good. Quickly, approaches, meaning there is a rich diversity and variegations, like a leaf. It's divided by many parts within 12. It's not a monolith. It depends on where we place the accent, right? If you place the accent like this in French, it means something else. If you place it like that, it means slightly different, okay? Some are socialists, like D.S. Kidney. Not all are socialists. Some 12 scholars, or even third world countries, are socialists. Some emphasize opposition more than others. Some stress reconstructing international law, international society, more than deconstructing it in terms of what they're emphasizing their work. Some stress feminism more than others. Some stress praxis. Like me, I once had debates with a few tutors about should we go on, in addition to our scholarship, to do praxis, to hang around in the corridors of power. Judge Galindo, the Brazilian scholar, goes to the National Law Commission. I'm a UN Special Rapporteur. Should we do that, right? We have to think carefully and systematically, and I'll offer some thoughts later about that. But not all trailers do that, and not all 12 scholars need to do that. I have to emphasize. We'll come back to that, okay? And I wouldn't say much about international law. I think most of us know what international law is. So overall, 12 is a scholarly movement united by a shared ethical commitment to intellectual and even practical. I put that in bracket because the intellectual and the practical for me is praxis. They're intimately connected to each other, right? First of all, our scholars expose these disadvantages, these structures and incidences of domination, to see how do we reform those structures and, if you like, practices of domination, or even texts that license or facilitate domination. And even in many cases, how do we retrench them, get rid of them from the international system in order to create a more just society, especially on the global level, but of course the global and the local and the domestic are interconnected, right, as well. So part of that is centering the rest, the famous quip, rather than merely only the West. And then the focus is on third world peoples, not necessarily just the states, So if you want to do that, the question is, how do you do that methodologically, right? If you want to center the third world peoples, if you want to root out disadvantage and dispossession and subordination and domination, how do you actually do that? The first is that you have to take history seriously. You must take history extremely seriously. And history is yesterday, just yesterday. It's already history. So I'm not, when I talk history, I'm not saying, 16th century alone. Of course, it's 16th century, but also yesterday. But it's not just history. It's global history, holistic. It's not just the history of the West. So, for example, and we'll come again and again to Antonio Yangi's work, for which he has just won the America's biggest international law prize, the Hudson Medal, which is to show basically that it was in Latin America, it was in the Americas that sovereignty was made, not in Westphalia. He was the first to show that. It was in the encounter between the natives of this land here and Europeans that sovereignty was finally fashioned out, what it meant. What order governed Europeans and these peoples who, to Victoria, were like us, but not quite so. To Sepulveda, they are not like us at all. And that was a debate at the time between these two international lawyers. And that's Anthony Angi's work that basically reshaped the discipline, right? And so that's an example of when you take global history, not just European history, seriously, that's what it leads you to. That's the kind of place you go, right? Because you begin to build in other knowledges, subjugated knowledges, other knowledges, right? In knowledges that have been ordered and confined to, and marginalized and confined to the periphery. So you take it much more seriously, and also when you take global history seriously, it also allows you to see much more clearly, see better the techniques of imperialism of the past and how they repeat themselves, even if slightly in different ways, right? So you're better able to recognize today imperialist techniques of the past, but that are repeating, if in milder forms, different forms, so you're better equipped to recognize them for yourself in today's international relations. You also have to take the quality of third world people seriously, right? Much more seriously. For example, when we hear Glebe talk about unilateral intervention, some countries have power to invade any other country. If you take the lives of third world people seriously, you would recognize that such invasions are 90% of the time against them. Not the people who want to invade. Of course, you remember Anatole France's law. You can enact a law that says no one should sleep under the bridge. But in fact, what you're saying is that poor people should not sleep under the bridge. So when you say someone has a right to unilateral intervention, what you're saying is that the most powerful countries have the right to. You're not saying that everyone has a right, every state or every people can just intervene. You can only intervene if you have the power to intervene, right? That's one of the things about taking the quality of third world peoples more seriously. You have to also take the agency of third world people seriously, which is, we must start from the assumption that third world peoples think and do. Right? In my own permanent history of national human rights law, this is not often the case. Right? We don't start from the assumption that people in villages in Africa have developed ideas about their human dignity, practice it day to day. We don't. And I'll come back to Bakao Mutua's work, the African Cultural Fingerprint on Human Rights. This is what he did, and that's what led him to that. Right? If you take it seriously that they think and they do, then when you approach them, when you encounter them, when you study them, you have that behind your mind, and that completely reshapes the way in which you engage with them, not simply assuming that there is nothing there, which was very common until recently, in much so-called scholarship. And then dwellers have a strong suspicion, we don't say rejection, suspicion of Glebe assertions of common humanity and universality. I just illustrated with an example of the encounter of Europeans with the natives of the Americas, right? What was the structure of the argument that the Europeans made? It was like, we are both humans. We have common humanity. It's just that your humanity is somehow less. Do we hear that every day? We do. We continue to hear that every single day, and that's why we should run your countries for you. The IMF should tell you what to do about your economy. That's why we should tell you what to do about human rights. No, it's not your human rights ideas, it's ours. You can't have any human rights idea. I encountered that at the UN. Nobody says it. And that's why I said you have to look at history in order to recognize the structure of that argumentation repeats today. And even those who repeat it are not aware a lot of times that's what they're doing. And they would deny that that's what they're doing. But that's exactly the same structure of the argument, right? So that's why dwellers are very suspicious of universality. You start from a position of universality. We accept universality, but you have to start by suspecting it. What is the politics behind the assertion of universality? If it's a progressive politics, then you're more liable to embrace it. If it's not a progressive politics, a politics of domination, then you need to discard it or reject it. Tony Angie showed that in that paper, a famous paper in Social and Legal Studies Journal. Sona Raja tells us exactly what I've said, the famous international investment law scholar, 201. George will kill me if I keep using 201 and 2. And then lastly, Balakrishna Rajagopal tells us that we need to continuously think ways of offering resistance. It's not enough to say, this is how international law has behaved. We have exposed international law for its norms or doctrines or practices that marginalize or dispossess or disadvantage third world peoples, but what do we do about it? Right? What intellectual ideas can we offer that allow those who practice it or who think about it to oppose, resist, subvert the global powers' ideas or practices, right? So that's resistance. And that resistance doesn't need to only come from states. That resistance can come from ordinary peoples, from civil society, and sometimes you need transnational alliances. I will get to that, hopefully. I'm spending too much time on it. I didn't intend to spend so much time on explaining what TWIL is, but I think I'll speed it up a bit. In terms of accomplishments, there are two broad kinds of TWIL accomplishments. The scholarly accomplishments in research, writing, and so on, and then in practice that I want to highlight. So I just want to emphasize, I'm only going to emphasize a few examples because I don't really have time, and I can't go through the massive, just the explosion of TWIL work that we have had, over the last, say, 15 years. It's been just amazing. But if you want to read more, I've given you two papers that do a good job. The one is very recent paper by Anthony Angie, massive paper, 106 pages. In the European Journal of International Law 2023, just came out a month ago or so. And it's his personal retrospective on the movement. And it goes through like almost every almost everything that is like a book. And then James Gaffey recently, 2 years or 3 years ago, I gave the Grotius lecture at the American Society of International Law, The Promise of International Law, Third World Perspective. So this will hopefully make up for all the deficiencies of the examples that I'm going to make. So I want to just speak a little bit about some theoretical and substantive TWIL arguments that made a mark on the discipline of international law. I've already spoken about Tony Angie's work quite a bit, so I'll skip that in terms of his impact. Karen Mickelson, I can't not include her. She was my teacher. 1998 article basically affirmed that there is a third world, not was, there remains a third world, and her chorus of voices, explanation, and then demonstrated basically that TWIL was possible, that there are distinctive modes of thought that you can characterize as third world approaches, and then charges us to go to history. And I'll come back to this because the new superpower rivalry, the new Cold War, as Chinese scholar Ming Wan calls it, the new Cold Peace that we have, harkens back to the first Cold War, right? This time not between Soviet Union and the US, this time between the US and China, right? And what do we do as TWILers or people from the third world in a Cold War where two superpowers are opposed to each other and clashing, and you're caught in the middle, right? So earlier, third world scholars and societies responded to that kind of situation before. What did they do? They came up with new international economic order, Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, UNCTAD, that still exists, and so many other ways, non-alignment, G77, NAM, and so on. So Karen says we have to mine the material from these earlier struggles. Why did they succeed in what they succeeded at achieving? Why did they not succeed in some of what they wanted to achieve? And what are the ways to enhance the successes of TWIL and the third world peoples in today's Cold Peace? A similar, but not exactly the same situation, right? So we have to go back. But in 1998, she didn't know there would be this Cold Peace, but she told us we must always hearken to history. Let me quickly move on to Matao Mutua have already spoken about his piece in the Virginia 1995 piece, Virginia Journal of International Law, basically that other human rights languages exist that we don't know anything about. Because you know why? We didn't think that these people think. Are you getting my point? It's not because they were not there. They were there in plain sight, but we didn't think. Imagine me going to a village where almost nobody speaks English and me trying to tell them about the UDH. When they already use languages of human rights. Okay? So my grandmother understood that I had a duty to take care of her. That's the same as what we call the rights of the elderly today. She understood it. She didn't go to school, Western education one day. This was an existing language of human rights. Why don't we use it? So Matao, in that paper on the language of duties, thought about why not use the languages that already exist in order to speed up the implementation of human rights in rural Africa, where most Africans live, right? Signal contribution to international human rights. James Garthy, this basically just debunked the idea that a new customary international law rule on preemptive strikes had emerged after 9/11. We all know that preemptive strikes are bad now, don't we?
Yes.
Since Ukraine. But in 2005, twinners were saying it. Nobody listened until America's interests were engaged. Okay? we know that they're bad. We've always known. This is what I tell my class at Johns Hopkins. We've known this. You're not teaching us anything new. The issue is, why are you coming late to the party? You know. Louis Zaslava and Surya Pahuja, their piece in, I forgot the name of the German, it's a German journal now. Yeah? Yes. Thank you so much for rescuing me on that one. So basically, the traders already tend to factor in, of course, the everyday life, the material conditions of the poor, of third world peoples, but they also told us that we need to do that by looking at other sides, quotidian, day-to-day sides, right? Administrative procedures, artifacts, other kinds of social spaces that we don't ordinarily look at in order to see how international law operates in the daily lives of poor people, of third world peoples. So I think that's an important methodological sort of contribution to international law. And if allow me, if I may say so myself, to harp on my own piece in 2005 on newness, or rather that Augusto and I were discussing yesterday when he gave me a ride from the port. Sorry, I'm outing you about helping me out. And basically, what I showed is that practices of asserting newness in international law are deeply political practices. They have nothing to do with any kind of principled practice. Calling something new suddenly makes something that you could not do yesterday possible, right? So post 9/11, 9/11 happened. Oh my God, it's never happened in the history of the world that 3,000 people were killed, right? You know, and I look around, I'm Nigerian, well, it has happened repeatedly, right? So why is this particular happening different and new? So that's what I was responding to, and saying that no, this is simply a iteration of the way in which newness assertion is used to basically mask a political project, usually a politics of domination of global power. Because if a poor, weak country says, well, you know, the colonialists invaded us and it's new, nobody will say international law should change. Actually, Britain's argument around Charicos Island is that international law should not change, right? And so that is that's what I was trying to show in that paper. So those are like contributions substantive to the literature, to the discipline. But there are other measures of scholarly influence. TWIL has established very strong cross-fertilization with indigenous studies, Latin critical studies in North America. They are called LATCRITs, feminist legal studies, African American studies, critical race theory, critical legal studies, and so on. Upendra Bakshi has also spoken about what he calls a carnival. I'm in Brazil, so carnival should excite, right? Who wants to go to a carnival today? You can go to a tour carnival. You just be reading till your eyes turn red. So there's a carnival in the production of 12 academic articles. I see it as a carnival. It's amazing to me, you know? So much, so good, from everywhere, different colors. It's like a carnival, right? Articles, special issues, books, you know? And in the James Gatti's 2021 article that I mentioned earlier, he gives a massive bibliography that supports what I'm saying, yeah? Publication and influence. TWIL has had a lot of publication, even in journals in which they were previously excluded, right? And it's so amazing. B.S. Chimney's paper on possible international law from a TWIL perspective is the most downloaded paper ever in the American Journal of International Law, in the history of the journal. The most downloaded paper. This since downloading became a thing, right? And yet, if you had submitted maybe 10 years before that, it would definitely not have been published. And later, that's why I'm a believer in praxis. Later, I might speak about why it was published. It didn't just happen. You know, there was no sudden change of mind in the establishment of international law. TWILers infiltrated the board. That's why that article was published. Academics has politics. And that's why I believe in actual practical things that you do in the service of an academic project, right? But it turns out that people were thirsting for that kind of work already, but it was being shut out, right? We have a dizzying number of PhDs and master's theses, both that have been finished, that are being done. Some are in the room, doctoral fellowships, and so on. TWILers have even become presidents of universities, which makes me nervous, you know. They begin to make those decisions I don't like. Deans of law schools, endowed chairs, professors. See, we are here. When we are here, Jose is here. Madame Barreto is here. A lot of them. TWIL has a journal, the flagship journal. Again, I didn't have anything to do with this. This is all younger scholars with so much energy doing a lot of these things. They started the journal on their own. So many other journals. The African Journal of International Economic Law, founded by two TWILers, Gatti and Akinkugbe. I started one myself, not as famous. Editorship of journals. So many TWILers are now on the board of the American Journal of International Law as a deliberate practice to open up the discipline to other ideas from which the discipline, at least the mainstream of the discipline, had tried to exclude in the past. Active. I'm saying this on tape. They know what I'm talking about because those battles were fought and they know. Keynotes have been given. Angie and Gatti have given the Grotius lecture, which is a prestigious lecture at the American Society of International Law. Makamutua and Gatti have been vice presidents. People have served on the executive council. Your own networks everywhere. Your own robust network here in Brazil. Very fascinating and amazing productivity. The African International Economic Law Network that's meeting this June in Ghana. Many networks in Colombia. I was telling Manuel in the morning. South Africa, India. So sad Nigeria is not there. A 12 lecture series at Johns Hopkins and at Osgood Law School. The Asian Society of International Law. In fact, their conference this year is going to be in Bandung. Maybe later we'll have time if people want to know what Bandung represents. Hudson Medal to Anthony Angie, leading 12 scholar. This medal is significant, not because it's from the American Society, but because of the measure it gives us of the progress TWIL has made in the mainstream. right? This would have been unthinkable in 1997 or in 1987, 2007 or 2017 for that matter. Right? Again, it didn't just drop from the sky. There was a praxis to it that happened with that medal. He just got it this April. So, good segue to praxis, right? So other than scholarly achievements, TWIL should and has engaged in actual real-life praxis. I believe that academia is real life. You're all here. I can see you. I can touch and feel you if you let me. Yeah? We're real enough. But you know what I mean by real-life praxis, what I call non-academic habitats outside the academy. TWIL has now had 5 or so UN special rapporteurs, my humble self being one. Tendai Achume just stepped down as rapporteur for racism. Krishna Madegopal at MIT, Michael Patrick. On the right to food, this is like all human rights mechanisms. So you might ask, is it just that they occupied those offices? No. It is that they brought a TWIL praxis to those offices that's important, right? So for example, Tendai led the work after the killing of George Floyd. For the first, she moved African states to call for the first time ever for an independent inquiry into racism in the United States. Of course, the EU allied with the US to kill the idea, but they couldn't kill it completely. So the idea was there would be a report from the High Commissioner for Human Rights on Racism in the US, but also a new expert mechanism to advance racial justice. She did 50% of that work. Okay? From a TWIL perspective, this June I will present a revised UN draft declaration on the right to international solidarity to the UN Human Rights Council that I've drafted with help from some authors. It goes back to Bandung, solidarity, and the importance of that in bringing change to the international system. I'm just giving you a few examples. In the former UN Subcommissioner of Human Rights, you had Joe Lokonyango. I served on the UN Human Rights Advisory Committee for 6 years before now. In my role, I chaired the body that created a new rapporteur to study the killing and harming and discrimination against people with albinism. We helped create that mandate. The mandate against unilateral sanctions, I wrote the paper that justified, I wrote the justification because third world countries wanted to create the mandate, but they needed the intellectual justification. I wrote that paper, personally, because you have to argue with a scholar's mind systematically, so otherwise it will be poo-pooed in the Human Rights Council. Once I wrote that paper, in fact, once I submitted the paper, they brought back the resolution 6 months before and passed it immediately because they knew it couldn't be. So that's the kind of work you as scholars can do when you're in those spaces, right? It's not just to go there, sit there, and fly to Geneva and back. It's nice, although you pay $25, $30 for your burgers, but it's nice to go to Geneva, but that's not why the scholars should go to Geneva. You should go there to have an impact, and you can have an impact, is what I'm trying to tell you. It's not going to be easy, it's tough, and you will not always have an impact, but you can have an impact. A new UN expert mechanism on the right to development, as well as a new draft treaty on the right to development. If Kedam Baye and Dudu Dieng, two Senegalese scholars who proposed the right to development in the 60s, if they came to the UN today and they saw that there was a new expert mechanism as well as a draft treaty, they'll be shocked. They'll probably fall off their seats, right? But this is happening in part because of the work of some TWILers like Meher Kanad at the UN University for Peace in Costa Rica. I supported that work as an expert advisor as well. George Galindo, for example, is on the International Law Commission. Anyway, there's a lot of other things. There's a TWIL Academy that's happening in in Colombia this summer. That is praxis, that is training the next generation, that is extremely important. And TWIL is, as I call it, homing. You know, like a homing pigeon is coming back home. Meaning, it's now being, a lot of TWILers now teach and live in the global south, right? Unlike those of us in Canada and the US. And I think that's important. It's extremely important because they're close to, if you like, the students there, right? They can train more of them. We train some as well, but they can train a lot more. They're close to the legislatures, the foreign ministries there. They can provide advice. And believe me, they're thirsty. When I've had occasion to live in Nigeria, I lived there for 3 years recently. You know, I know the impact I had by being on the ground. So I really value that. There was recently a 12 big conferences in Cairo and Singapore, one smaller in South Africa, and there have been African International Economic Law conferences in Kenya and Ghana, and so on. So TWILers, my point, overall point is that TWILers are not just reading and writing. TWILers have been, that's TWIL scholars, have been having an impact on the ground, all in the service of their scholarship, also all in the service of deploying and using the scholarship to make a better world, right? And I think the two are intimately connected. So, reflections on the future of TWIL, which is what my talk is titled, but I wanted to go through these preliminary issues in order to set the stage. Well, so as we have seen, TWIL has grown, but of course there remains a lot more to do, and there are many important gaps. So let me begin with the gaps. The first is, yes, there's a lot of TWIL work now being done in the third world, the global south, however you define it, but it's included here, right? You're a wonderful professor, is doing a fantastic job here, but not enough TWILers are like Professor Swift. Professor Fabia here. Not enough, right? There's not enough of that in global south. Living and working there and teaching every day, maybe not weekends, but every day, students in the global south. I think we can do more. I've tried to go back a couple of times, you know, that's a long story. But the times I've been there have been impactful, you know, in terms of being on the ground. So we need to close that gap, in my view, more. Of course, there's a lot of TWILers in Latin America, living and working there, Bangladesh, in South Africa. And I've used tech, for example, to give talks to African audiences, African students in South Africa, in Bangladesh, in India. So there are ways we can also bridge the gap of not being there physically. But as important, and I think Professor Galindo will agree with this, there's not enough engagement. Well, I say he will agree because he is the legal advisor of a foreign ministry of Brazil, which is a very important country, right? And he understands what legal advice, how much it matters, and the quality and also the orientation of the legal advice, right? But I don't think there's enough of close enough engagement. There's not enough of that between 12 scholars and practitioners of the discipline of international law, right? Whether they are at the UN, diplomatic delegations, or they are at home in the foreign ministries, or in other contexts, right? There's not enough close engagement. They are thirsty. They're thirsty. I'll give you a very 1 minute brief story, and you understand how important. When I was in the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee, and I said some of the things I said now about the structure of human rights. I used to say that the advisory committee, because it's a think tank, it's like a scholarly setting. But when we meet, diplomats are in the audience, they watch. When I finished my term, I was about to finish my term, I got an anonymous email and said, why don't you apply, anonymous, why don't you apply to be Special Rapporteur on International Solidarity and Human Rights? Till this day, I don't know where it came from. But I suspect it was from one of those government delegations saying, we need him to be. It didn't come from me. I had said goodbye to the UN after 6 years. I was tired. I said I'm not going to do any other work. He said, and because of that, I applied. You know, one time when I finished giving the paper, the South African director in the foreign ministry, lady, once I finished, she ran and gave me a big hug. I was like, I didn't know her, never met her. Then she whispered, said, "Thank you, my brother." That, I'm just trying to illustrate for you the thirst for twill knowledge and work that there is out there among practitioners. And there are twillers in those ministries. There are twillers of the UN officials, bureaucrats. They're there. I know some of them. All right? And they can't say the things that we can say as experts. Are you getting me? Because they are bureaucrats. Their boss is 20 ahead of them. So they can't take those risks, right? But I don't care. I'm tenured. Then nobody's going to sack me. So I can say certain things that they cannot say. And that's why it's important to bring a comparative advantage, to closely engage. We also learn from them. I don't have time to start telling you a lot of things we learn from them, both UN bureaucrats and the diplomats. And they learn from us. So it's a symbiosis, mutual learning that occurs, that improves even my own academic work. Excuse me. And also, not all sub-areas, all sub-fields like of international law have received significant trail attention, like artificial intelligence and technology, for instance, taxation, commercial law. You know, my last 3 PhD students came to me and they wanted to do human rights. I committed human rights suicide. I said, go and do artificial intelligence. You can call it artificial intelligence and human rights, but emphasize the artificial intelligence. The world is going AI. Twillers need to understand it. Third world peoples need to understand it. It's going AI. And I hate to say this, it's from war to agriculture to cars to anything, right? So we need to begin to study and think about these in a systematic way with 12 lenses, right? And I'm so happy that they took my advice, the last 3 ones. But I didn't force them, it was a suggestion, right? Commercial law, sanctions, very rich. I've just done a blog, just a 5-page blog, very complicated, with Dr. Nathaniel Tillahu. It will be published in the Yale International Law Journal. It's a blog, not a full-blown paper yet, about sanctions. Very worrying what is going on with sanctions and countermeasures. Okay, so those are gaps. In terms of a scholarly agenda, as quickly as I can, there are a number of ideas that I'm just going to offer as examples for future agenda. And there's a million of great ideas that twillers are working on for the future. These are just examples, right? First question, which I've tried to think about, we need to know and study how, and underline much more exactly, much more precisely, imperialism, coloniality, domination, how exactly do they operate today, not yesterday. How do they operate today? It's not necessarily in the exact same ways as they operated yesterday, right? So how do they work? And around the globe, right? It's like sequencing the DNA of a virus. You need to do that, right? In order to know the points of entry, how to cure it. When COVID-19 came out first, what did the scientists first do? They sequenced it. That's how they got the vaccine. You have to know what to attack. So unless you understand in very minutiae, with an electron microscope, how imperialism and coloniality works today, and works in different settings, different organizations, not the general. We understand that imperialism is there, global power circulates, operates, shapes and reshapes, and causes harm, but in detail. We need to, in a very exact and almost ethnographic detail, right? So, are there any continuities? What are the continuities and discontinuities? These are things we should be looking out for. What are they more exactly? We must first map them and describe them, analyze them, and then respond to them, right? What are the geopolitical variations? Does it operate differently in Latin America versus Africa versus China? Or from China, is it different? Does it look different if it's China to Africa or China? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? And what are the entailed possibilities for more effective resistance? That's what I talked about, sequencing the DNA of the virus. You see the possibilities, right? These are the proteins you can attack or not, right? This is how it operates. It attaches that protein, therefore you need to stop it in order to stop it from infecting people. That's how we need to be looking at it in minute detail, right? And under what specifiable conditions can you resist it? You can't always resist global power. But under what conditions is resistance effective? One thing, for example, we all know from the 70s and New International Economic Order and so on, is that the main weapon is solidarity. The moment the world doesn't have solidarity, you have nothing. Right? So, but that's old knowledge. But even if we agree that that applies today, in what more exact ways can you leverage that solidarity? Where does it work best? When? Right? Against which global power? And so on. Right? Deep case study methodology, or what you might call thick description, is required. Is what I'm asking, I'm suggesting. Right? Is it more global ethnography? The late Saleh Ngomeri once did this famous paper on social ethnography and international law, right? She beat me to it, I keep saying. Because I had this thing I'd written out, I want to write a paper on social ethnography. I wanted to call them an awesome twosome, right? But then I went to research it, and so she had already written the paper. How many times does that happen to us? We think we have a great idea, and of course the more brilliant woman had written the paper. So anyway, but it's a kind of global ethnography, but it's global, but very minute. We need to be looking at it with an electron microscope, seeing the minutiae. How precisely does it circulate? How precisely does it shape? What are its most potent weapons and approaches that it adopts? And then, before we're able to respond more effectively, right, as scholars, and then arm those who in praxis can respond. But there are, because I've been thinking about such studies myself, there are access issues of access to the data that you need, for instance, right? You don't just walk to the U.S. State Department of, say, U.S. Department of Defense and say, give me your data about how you operate, effectively, right? How exactly do you operate? I want it in the detail. They're not going to give it to you. And even if they're in archives, a lot of that stuff is classified, except Trump takes them home. And that's just a joke, right? About him taking home classified material. Most of these are classified. That declassification happens 50 years after. That's too late. So there are real methodological problems. So what to do? Do we do what we call methodological deception? Do we pretend to be special rapporteurs and go to countries and ask questions? Will your university ethics committee, those damn ethics committee people, I'm just kidding, who always say no, 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 like my daughter, no, 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 to every research you want to do, will they permit it? Right? So these are the things we need to grapple with, right? But we need to begin to seek it. We will not get everything, I'm under no illusion, but we need to see what we can get. Sometimes you have what they call them these days, those people that just leak information, whistleblowers, and things like that. But we need to pay attention, more attention. Some attention is being paid, but we need more attention. And then we repeat the same kind of thing with global institutions, not just states, right? So there's another important point. I just, last week, 2 weeks ago, gave a talk, keynote to the Japanese Association of World Law. this association was inspired by the Japanese Judge Tanaka, who gave one of the few dissents in the Southwest Africa cases and was against apartheid, when the majority was for apartheid, right? So he's a very popular among progressive Japanese international lawyers. And so we were talking about Japan being caught in the middle of the China-US confrontation. And I told them, imagine if Japan, such a mighty power, is caught in the middle. Imagine what third world countries feel, right? Because they asked me to bring a third world perspective. They wanted to hear about it. And that's what I told them. That was essential message. Just imagine how powerful you are. You feel caught, they genuinely feel caught in the middle. They depend on the US for security, but on China for economic survival. What to do? Either way, trouble looms. If they lean toward the US, China is angry. If they lean toward China, the US is angry. What to do? That is the condition of being third world. That's what it's called, right? Can they be non-aligned? No, they wouldn't qualify because they have an alliance with the US. So they wouldn't qualify. But anyway, so Lingguang tells us that we're in this cold peace. Not quite a war, cold war, but cold peace. It's peaceful, nobody's fighting, but it's pretty fraught, right? It's pretty problematic right now. Smaller countries are caught in the middle. A changing world is upon us. Is it a recycled world? Is it the exact same world that we lived during the superpower Cold War? I know some of the young people are going to be like, what? Cold War? What do you mean? When? Did that ever happen? Yes, it happened. Cold War. Between the Soviet Union, doesn't exist anymore, and the US. Is it just the same old corporate fight repeat that we are getting now? To what extent precisely is it new? We need to first understand what the character of this cold peace is and is going to become, right? What exactly is it? What are the continuities and discontinuities, as I like to say? And then what lessons for Twitter international law practice can we learn from the previous Cold War, previous superpower confrontation? Of course, like I said, Cold War peoples are caught in the middle. What is the nature precisely of this predicament? Take, for example, already, Ukraine is an example, right? It's either you're for us or you're against us. You can't be non-aligned on Ukraine. You can be, theoretically, but you suffer consequences, as South Africa is learning. Maybe India is a little too big for them to push around, because India, the Indian Prime Minister, who is no saint, is addressing next week the U.S. Congress, which is an honor apparently that is being given to him. But compare the reaction over Russian invasion, occupation of parts of the Ukraine, to British occupation of the Chagos Islands, which belongs to Mauritius, against international law, against the International Court of Justice decision. Where is the outrage on that one? Right? These are some of the problematics, right? So these are some of the things that we have to deal with. What to do, right? I know I'm raising more questions than answers, but that's my job. I'm just kidding. but I'm just envisioning what we might begin to think of as true scholars in this emergent world. So, do we bring what I've called in the keys the Bandung ethic of solidarity? Because that's what Bandung was about when third world leaders gathered in Bandung, Indonesia, in the 60s, early in the 60s, right? Was it the 50s? No? 55, right? Yeah. So even before Nigeria, most African countries became independent. They gathered, and it was about solidarity mostly, but among whom? Right? Among whom should this solidarity be? What has this ethic of solidarity that came from Bandung, that the third world has practiced with non-aligned movement, G77 and China, what has it been good for in terms of fruits, bearing fruits for third world peoples? What has it not been good for? We need to look at that again. People are beginning to do that. I think Umut, who has recently published something. Others, there's a whole book on it, which Judge Trindad, before he died, actually cited in his separate opinion at the ICJ in the Chagos case, that book on Bandung. Under what conditions can the third world optimize, that is, get the most out of its solidarity? Under what conditions? We need to think about specifying this more clearly and in more detail. Now, non-alignment, is this still available to the third world? As I said, the U.S. behavior around Ukraine suggests that it's not. Let me be clear, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is completely illegal. I oppose it. I don't want to muddy the waters and suggest anything otherwise. It's just that what is good for the goose is also good for the gander. Every occupation, illegal occupation, should also be opposed, and people who illegally occupy countries should also be sanctioned with the same ferocity, is all I'm saying. What does the persistence of the G77 and also of the persistence of the G77 plus China format or formation, what does it suggest to us? Is there a lesson in solidarity there that is needed? Should NAM, the non-aligned movement, become something else? Right? These are the kinds of questions I believe that should occupy us. And will international law be useful in this cold peace? To what extent will it be useful? Should we continue? Is it that we have a hammer and we keep looking for the nail of international law? Because we are trained as international lawyers, right? So there's a path dependence there, right? Is it going to be useful as an independent variable, as an independent factor, right? I think we need to think clearly about that. And then what role, more exactly, can transnational social movements, especially those that have influence in the centers of global power, right? We've seen, for example, on essential drugs, HIV, malaria, and so on, that it mattered that there was a powerful movement in the global north that pressured their own governments before you could get whatever amendment to the WTO. I think it's 31 bis eventually that the Doha Protocol, the Doha Agreement became of TRIPS, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement. So what role would they play, social movements, in the common world? And then sanctions. I think I'm going to maybe skip this because it's very heavy on a Friday night. But just to summarize it at a high level, and if you want, we can discuss. There are two main problems, which is distinction, meaning if you study the law of war, you understand distinction. If you want to cause harm in international law, there's a usual separation between combatants and non-combatants, civilians and non-civilians. So all the combat. My French is terrible, but in targeted states, right? So that's distinction, and the other one is proportionality, right? So if somebody just touches you like that and you don't like it, you're not allowed to, kick their stomach. I'm just putting it in a very, ordinary way so that you understand it. Right? That's what it's supposed to be. But this has all but collapsed. Both distinction and proportionality have all but collapsed, even more so than it has collapsed in the law of war, in the law of sanctions, if there's any law. You can sanction a society to kingdom come, cause 3 million deaths, 300,000 children can die, but there's no problem. Because you know what? The goal is human rights and democracy. Are you getting where I'm going with that? I'm putting it very, because I don't want to go through the heavy technical thing this Friday evening, because people might be tired, but this is what proportionality is. And also then the length of the period of time over which you levy the sanctions causes even more devastation across the economy, right? And in terms of this severity, even if you do the humanitarian carve-outs, let's say you say, we are going to allow imports of children's medicines and so on, food and all that, okay? What happens is, then you sanction the key place where that country earns money. There's going to be inflation that wipes out everything, because even the food and medicine price will be above reach for the average person, right? So there's people who've done actual, like, ethnographers work on Iraq that showed, you know, like the rampant devastation that even war did not cause in Iraq. So the question we're asking in that blog post in the Yale Journal of International Law is, it may be slower violence, but it's violence all the same, right? Why should the law of war be more regulated than sanctions if it causes just as much violence? Just a little slower. You don't die that minute, but you die maybe a month or 2 months later or 6 months later, right? So that's severity. Proportionality is that, and it's implied in what I've just said, there is no distinction. If you sanction SWIFT, for example, SWIFT is an exchange system for the global economy. It's an essential grid work. What you're doing is you are devastating the economy, which does not then discriminate between anyone in that economy, no matter whether they are responsible or not responsible for the conduct that you want stopped. So your intention could be great, but you're harming everybody in the economy. So, and in fact, in the early days, maybe they got legal advice from their legal advisors. U.S. press, Biden's press secretaries used to come out and say, we want to wreck the Russian economy. If you said that in war, that you're going to devastate civilian population, you'll be a war criminal. But you can say that about sanctions. They stopped saying it, so I think they got some advice that you don't say that. You don't do that, right? But there is no law that actually stops it. The only constraint now is the UN and some sanctions regimes that have these humanitarian carve-outs or exemptions. But if, as I've said, even those exemptions don't work. Is either there's too much paperwork, the food gets there, even, well, there are ways in which the UN itself, the UN, not the states like the US, made the humanitarian carve-outs better after what the terrible things that happened in Iraq, which is, don't put states, UN or US officials in charge of checking whether the food should go in, put bureaucrats, UN bureaucrats. More food went in, cheaper, reached people, right? But still, if they're going in there and they're going at a price that nobody can afford because you devastated the entire economy, is in shambles, should we be regulating economic sanctions much more strictly, the levying of economic sanctions? And why is this a 12 project? It's a 12 project because sanctions are 99% of the time against third world peoples. That's why it's a 12 project. It's a tool of the powerful. Nigeria can't sanction the US. There's a few dreamers in Nigeria who think that, but we just can't. Gone are the days when Nigeria could sanction Britain. Nigeria did, because Nigeria then was an oil power. And that's how Zimbabwe got independence. But we took over British Petroleum and called it African Petroleum. Not a single penny of compensation. And nothing happened. That's power. But Nigeria doesn't have that power, right? So that's why it's a 12 project. So I've already described all that. We can talk more about it. I've already talked as well about praxis. My argument, as many people know, is that we need more praxis, not less, because it brings us much closer to the juncture of thought and experience, and each feeds each other. All right, I'm just going to bring this to an end. We can, if you want, I have a whole spiel about the perils of praxis. I know you'll be surprised because I've just gone on and on about how we must do praxis, but I think that we must also always think of the flip side. There are dangers, if you like, of a scholar doing praxis. And we can talk about it because I want to give time for other people to present. We can talk about it in conversation. If people want to know, and also I've circulated my my slides. I've given it to your fabulous professor here, and you have my permission to share. There are both strategic and tactical perils and conceptual theoretical perils, and we can talk about that if you like later on. So let me just close by saying that for me, TWIL remains acutely, and I should underline that quickly, acutely relevant today, as relevant today as it did in the 1960s for me. I've already shown the gaps that remain. I've already shown the many interesting questions, and there are millions more that we could be working on. But more importantly, almost all the third world still remains dominated, excluded, and disadvantaged, including in part by their own leaders. Right? When they don't repair their hospitals and they go for medical treatment in Germany every other week, they participate in the immiseration of third world peoples, right? And that's what I acknowledge there. But, despite all of this, the fact that most of the third world is still immiserated, TWIL has greatly strengthened, as I showed, in the last 2.5 decades. And we need to think about what this means for the ability of TWIL to realize its other goals, and what this will mean for subaltern peoples. The framework governance, meaning the outlines of the football stadium, right, how it is constructed. The rules have been made, not by us, not by the Global South, but we can still play inside the stadium, right? So that framework governance has been taken over. We can still play. We need to look at how we can reconstruct that framework, whether it's shaped that way or there's more space for us to play within. TWIL has much promise, in my view, as a framework that allows us to think through in more progressive ways our current situation in the third world, Global South, using our techniques, methods, and sensibilities. And in Anthony Angi's latest piece, 2023, European Journal of International Law piece, one thing that struck me reading that piece is his point, which I think is an important point. Because TWIL is often seen as this radical, third world, crazy movement. If TWIL succeeds, the world succeeds, right? It's the same way if the most immiserated people in any society are uplifted, society as a whole is uplifted, right? And so the TWIL is a cosmopolitan project. That is my conclusion, and it is another reason that it remains acutely relevant. The odds, of course, of achieving success, anything close to full success, are enormous. They're almost indescribable. And the tasks are immense and challenging. But for me, ever the optimist, the long arc of history, because I'm also an amateur historian, offers hope. Hope. And I end where I start, with a quote from my teacher, Terry Mickelson. I started with something from her, Chorus of Voices. I'm going to end with one of our latest pieces, which is TWILers hope, not faith. We have hope, not faith. We have hope because we have a sense that things could get better. Not that they will necessarily get better if we just throw up our hands and sing, "We are the world." Right? So there's a difference between hope and faith. And it's not original to me. I take it from her piece, Hope in a TWIL Register. And it's in the fantastic new journal that so Fabia is one of the editors, younger TWILers. I don't mean to call you young or old. Have started, and that's where I still call her Professor Mickelson after almost 30 years. Published this paper. It's a fantastic paper. You need to read it. Hope in a Two-Way Register. She begins by distinguishing optimism from faith, faith from hope. Two others have hope. We don't have blind faith that somehow it's all going to get better. Right? But there are reasons over the long arc of history for us thinking that it's going to be better. Thank you so much. Obrigado. Obrigado.
Thank you so much, Professor Okafor, for this enlightening lecture on, I would say, the past, present, and future of Tueyo and what we can really think about it. Before we move on to further discussions, I will now passar a palavra para a professora Fábia e mudando aqui para o português. Professora Fábia, é um prazer imenso tê-la aqui na Universidade Federal de Uberlândia. Temos uma jornada já, um caminho que traçamos e é um verdadeiro prazer poder fazer essa troca pessoalmente, especialmente depois da pandemia, e tê-la aqui na universidade é muito gratificante. Então, com isso eu lhe passo a palavra.
Boa noite a todas e todos, todes. Bom, tenho milhões de agradecimentos antes de começar. Eu tenho acompanhado, né, os trabalhos aqui do DICRI, os trabalhos, né, da professora Tatiana, professor Gabriel, todos que estão envolvidos no grupo. Participei do primeiro seminário online, o livro, a publicação. Então, é realmente um lugar privilegiado, né, para pensar o direito internacional de uma maneira muito mais interessante, produtiva, instigante. Quem dera tivesse tido a sorte de ter, né, um grupo assim na faculdade. Toda essa abordagem crítica chegou bem mais tarde na minha formação. Então, é muito bacana estar aqui, finalmente, no presencial, com todas e todos vocês. It's also a pleasure to share this panel with Professor Okafor. It was such an amazing presentation, and of course makes my work much easier now. No, but it's really nice to have you here in Brazil, and I think even though we don't have many places where we are still growing in the Tueyo network and everything, this is a very important place, and it's wonderful to have you here. Muito bom. Eu queria conversar com vocês. Tá dando algum erritos? Qualquer coisa me falem. Não tem problema. Bom, mas eu vou começando, porque na verdade o meu PowerPoint é cheio de fotos, então eu queria hoje, nessa fala, tentar trazer a conversa sobre Tueyo para o contexto latino-americano, né? Então é justamente buscar buscar entender como que nós, do lugar que nós estamos, das instituições que nós estamos, do tipo de estudo que a gente faz, a gente pode se conectar com essa literatura, mas mais do que isso, né? Considerando o tipo de perspectiva crítica que nós sempre tivemos na América Latina, e aqui não só, por exemplo, os autores decoloniais, que o José Manuel Barreto falava hoje de manhã, né? Os decoloniais latinos, que não estão no direito, né? Estão nas humanidades, nas ciências sociais, mas uma sensibilidade crítica latino-americana que nós sempre tivemos, né? E que de alguma maneira, obrigada, gente, permite uma conexão muito interessante com Tueyo. O professor Okafor, né, já fez uma retomada mega detalhada e substantiva das abordagens terceiro-mundistas ao direito internacional. Então eu já queria pular diretamente para como, pelo menos na minha experiência e na minha pesquisa, esses temas têm se articulado, né? Como essa sensibilidade do sul global, de alguma forma, muda a maneira como a gente pensa o direito internacional desde uma certa posicionalidade. Então aqui é muito claro, né? Eu falo como alguém deste lado do mundo, apesar estou atualmente afiliada a uma instituição canadense, mas sigo pensando o direito internacional como alguém que vem da América Latina. Vai andar como PowerPoint também nessa loja? Aqui, tá? Essa parte. Então, eu queria aqui sugerir, né, de maneira alguma isso é algum tipo de receita pronta ou alguma abordagem top-down, mas pelo menos da forma como eu venho pensando o direito internacional, como essa sensibilidade terceiro mundista ou do sul global conversa com algumas questões muito específicas latino-americanas. E aqui eu quero também fazer um ponto metodológico, talvez muito claro, né? Eu acho que e isso foi dito pelo professor Okafor na sua fala, né, quando ele pergunta como exatamente a gente pode pensar essas questões relacionadas a Tueil, né, como determinadas continuidades e descontinuidades acontecem no mundo, né, como as técnicas imperialistas ainda se reproduzem. Eu acho que é o momento da gente partir para temas mais substantivos, né? Então, ok, estamos na América Latina, que tipo de experiência a gente tem nessa região, né, pensando que devem, né, provavelmente existir questões regionais que são muito parecidas, mas também particularidades, questões que de alguma forma se apresentam de formas diferentes, né? Então, queria comentar com vocês como que Tueil, de alguma maneira, vem aterrizando na minha produção. É algo exemplificativo, né? Mas a tentativa de elencar aqui como que a lente de Tueil, né, dessas abordagens terceiro-mundistas, podem, de alguma forma, chamar a nossa atenção para problemas latino-americanos que vêm se reproduzindo há muitas décadas, né? Provavelmente desde que a gente se tornou independente, mas são questões que, óbvio, têm absoluta relação com o encontro colonial que marca a nossa região de maneira tão profunda. Então, quero comentar um pouco esses temas que me parecem importantes. Vários outros não serão mencionados aqui, então quero ser muito cautelosa com isso. É apenas uma ilustração de como Tueil tem operado um pouco na minha cabeça. Queria mencionar que essa estratégia parte da produção de juristas internacionalistas latino-americanos. Então, nas minhas pesquisas, eu tenho olhado para a produção de juristas latino-americanos, levando em consideração que o direito internacional tem total condição de dialogar, né, de ser mais um saber à mesa entre as humanidades e as outras ciências sociais aplicadas, de dialogar e trazer reflexões sobre a região latino-americana. Então, esse também é um esforço de colocar o direito internacional em diálogo com outros saberes, né? E não uma perspectiva, vamos dizer assim, doutrinária e formalista, né, do direito internacional, como vocês todos aqui nesse grupo já sabem e já trabalham numa outra chave. Então, a ideia é que o direito internacional pode servir de alguma maneira como um indício, como um caminho, como um possibilitador de discussões latino-americanas que são marcas de certas continuidades, pelo menos na minha perspectiva. A primeira delas, que eu acho que é impossível não referir, né, é a questão da intervenção. O João falou um pouquinho sobre isso hoje de manhã. A nossa região e não é uma exclusividade latino-americana, mas de alguma maneira nós temos a questão da intervenção como fundamental, né, para pensar problemas latino-americanos. E eu digo aqui, quando menciono a questão da intervenção, desde tentativas europeias de recolonização, né, pós-independência das repúblicas latino-americanas, nós tivemos várias intervenções europeias, inglesas, francesas, espanholas, né, na tentativa ainda de reproduzir uma lógica colonial. E posteriormente, é impossível não mencionar o imperialismo estadunidense na nossa região. E é aqui que eu acho que Tueil e os latinos críticos, né, que estão aí desde o final do século XIX, começo do século XX, conversam de uma maneira muito próxima, né? Nós temos uma sensibilidade anti-imperialista muito forte, faz parte da maneira como a gente pensa a América Latina, mesmo que seja pelos jargões, né, imperialismo yankee, fora, FMI, né, todas aquelas coisas que a gente está muito acostumado a ouvir, mas que informa a maneira como a gente pensa a América Latina. Então, eu queria só... gente, existem várias maneiras de contar essa história de intervenção na América Latina. Eu quis trazer, e vários números, se vocês forem olhar, tem gente que fala em, sei lá, mais de trocentas, não dá nem para dizer, né, como cada um conta com determinados critérios. Esse é um projeto de um grupo crítico de artistas nos Estados Unidos, que nos anos 80 resolve montar uma exposição no MoMA, com uma linha do tempo em que eles contam a história do intervencionismo na América Latina, desde a virada do século XX. Né? Então são várias instalações artísticas para nos lembrar de que a nossa região tem sido e de alguma maneira continua sendo objeto, locus, melhor dizendo, de determinados projetos imperialistas, né? Talvez não necessariamente uma recolonização formal, mas a tentativa de controle de corações e mentes na América Latina. Então, pensando nos impactos, na maneira como a gente consegue se conectar com o Twale desde a nossa própria posicionalidade latino-americana, me parece que o tema da intervenção é algo bastante importante, porque nos mostra, como se dá essa técnica imperialista que busca, seja de uma forma mais violenta na América Central, com interferências muito claras, derrubada de governos, apoio explícito a golpes de Estado, ou mesmo proxy wars, a intervenção em grupos revolucionários para desestabilização de governos, e aqui estou me referindo à ação estadunidense, desde a maneiras mais soft, como a gente vê na América do Sul. Eu estou usando aqui a distinção do Juan Pablo Scarfe, num livro que ele publicou, The Hidden History of International Law in the Americas, em que ele trata um pouco desse papel dos Estados Unidos, como ele empresta do Koskiniemi a ideia do civilizador gentil, como os Estados Unidos teriam utilizado o direito internacional como um civilizador e, claro, tentando, de alguma forma, seguir uma técnica imperialista de dominação na nossa região. Muito bem, então, intervenção me parece um dos temas fundamentais, A gente vê aqui, muito claramente, esse é um pôster do começo do século, da virada do século XIX para o XX, em que a gente teve a guerra, a gente teve toda uma questão com a independência de Cuba e a contraposição, do que seria esse papel dos Estados Unidos. De um lado, a gente vê aqui, antes da guerra, toda uma certa bagunça no país, ou seja, uma administração muito confusa, espanhola na ilha, e do lado de lá, enquanto a gente teria, com a influência dos Estados Unidos, uma Cuba muito mais organizada, sem correria para o banco, com educação, plantaçõezinhas e tudo mais, ou seja, uma clara menção ao caráter incivilizado da colonização espanhola, para depois afirmar as possibilidades dos Estados Unidos para a ilha. E aí, muito claramente, a bandeira estadunidense ela não está sendo colocada no território, num solo estrangeiro para aquisição de território, mas por toda a humanidade. Então, uma conversa, o próprio professor Okafor falou, o quanto a gente deve desconfiar dos universalismos. Nesse caso, óbvio que os Estados Unidos não estavam preocupados com humanity's sake, mas com a dominação desse espaço. Então, isso é absolutamente fundamental para a maneira como a gente pensa a América Latina, me parece, e é uma forma, algo que de alguma, pelo menos na minha cabeça, aparece quando a gente muda realmente a lente de análise e coloca essa perspectiva crítica, essa sensibilidade terceiro mundista ou do sul global para pensar a América Latina. Um outro ponto que me parece absolutamente importante é pensar como a ideia de América Latina tem sido articulada a partir de uma certa forma de estruturação do espaço. A região é algo que faz parte de como a gente imagina politicamente a América Latina, como as utopias latino-americanas vêm sendo articuladas, e também as utopias estadunidenses. Eu quis colocar aqui uma foto na época, doutrina Monroe e a ideia do hemisfério ocidental, a doutrina estadunidense, de que a América Latina não seria mais um espaço disponível para recolonização, mas algo que teria, né, um território aí de repúblicas livres, mas que a gente, ao final, entendeu o que isso significava, né, um espaço para a dominação estadunidense. Então, essa organização do espaço, apesar da gente ter com muita força, né, os estados latino-americanos, eu já vou comentar um pouco mais sobre isso, me parece que essa dimensão regional, né, algo que não é nem o Estado-nação e nem o universal do direito internacional, parece fazer muito sentido do nosso lado do mundo na forma como determinadas visões foram articuladas a partir dessa unidade espacial estendida que é a região. E para o bem e para o mal, né? Tanto do ponto de vista de um hemisfério que seria dominado pelos Estados Unidos, né, com o argumento de que nós não seríamos espaços para recolonização, desde perspectivas regionais mais radicais e anti-imperialistas, né, que a gente vai ter, por exemplo, com a Revolução Mexicana, depois a própria Revolução Cubana, ou seja, imaginações regionais mais fortes do ponto de vista do aspecto da sua resistência, né, a essas intervenções todas dos Estados Unidos. Então, pelo menos na forma como eu venho pensando o direito internacional, esse in-between, né, essa dimensão de meio de caminho que é a região, me parece ser algo importante e que em direito internacional também acho falta um esforço de pensar de maneira mais exata, né, o que a gente entende por região. Então, intervenção e regionalismo os dois aspectos. Um outro ponto que também me parece bem importante quando a gente muda a lente de análise, né, e, de novo, embarca nessa sensibilidade terceiro-mundista, desde a nossa própria posicionalidade latino-americana, é uma outra enorme continuidade que a gente vê desde a independência das repúblicas latino-americanas, que é a questão da dívida externa, né, como que nós já nos tornamos independentes, endividados, né, as dívidas da metrópole foram transferidas para as colônias e nós já saímos no preju imediatamente. E essas dívidas continuaram, né, nós temos ciclos de endividamento ao longo da história da América Latina. O Carlos Marichal, que é um historiador financeiro mexicano, conta essa história para o século XIX, mas a gente tem aqui mais pertinho na memória, talvez, né, todas as crises de dívida que a gente teve nos anos 70, nos anos 80, aqui na nossa região. Então, é uma questão que me parece uma continuidade muito grande e que, de alguma maneira, nós tivemos juristas internacionalistas latino-americanos preocupados com esse ponto. Aqui eu entro numa parte um pouquinho mais específica da pesquisa. A famosa doutrina Drago, que foi elaborada por um jurista argentino na virada do século XIX para o século XX, tratou justamente sobre a possibilidade do uso da força para a coleta de dívidas na América Latina. Se vocês forem abrir qualquer manual de direito internacional... Não contei o tempo, meu Deus, me avisa. Tá. Desculpa, gente, estava aqui, fiquei animada com tudo que foi dito. A gente vai ter se vocês virem qualquer manual aí de direito internacional, vocês vão ver uma listinha, né, de doutrinas latino-americanas, o que eu acho bastante, enfim, de alguma maneira, a gente precisa aprofundar, né, o que estava em jogo no caso dessas doutrinas, mas a doutrina Drago é uma que é sempre mencionada e foi uma elaboração desse jurista argentino, Luiz Maria Drago, à época ministro de Relações Exteriores da Argentina, como uma reação à cobrança de dívidas por países europeus com um bloqueio naval, ou seja, o uso da força, entre 1902 e 1903, na costa da Venezuela, alegando, né, que a Venezuela não honrou com o pagamento de várias categorias de dívidas, e que, portanto, eles, inicialmente, Inglaterra e Alemanha se uniram, né, para essa cobrança coercitiva, e depois a Itália fizeram um bloqueio naval na costa venezuelana. O Drago mobiliza uma interpretação de direito internacional para afirmar que o direito internacional não permite a cobrança coercitiva, né, o uso da força para a cobrança da dívida externa, né, da deuda pública, como ele diz nesse tema. O Drago é super articulado, se tivesse Instagram da vida ou outras redes na época, mas ele manda, deixa eu mostrar aqui para vocês, ele manda, essa aqui é o rascunho da nota, eu tirei essa foto visitando o arquivo histórico do Ministério de Relações Exteriores da Argentina, em Buenos Aires. O Drago redige uma nota em 1903 e ele envia essa nota para o diplomata argentino em Washington, e a partir disso nós temos uma disseminação da interpretação de Drago sobre o uso da força para a cobrança de dívidas. Esse texto é publicado no primeiro número do American Journal of International Law, ou seja, ele conseguiu um monte de followers, uma baita rede, influência. Mandou também para um outro jurista latino-americano, Carlos Calvo, que estava na França na época, membro do Instituto de Direito Internacional, e o Calvo circula essa nota entre vários juristas europeus. Olha aqui a interpretação de direito internacional que nós temos, né, sobre a impossibilidade de uso da força para cobrança de determinadas categorias de dívida, né? Vejam, no fim do dia, o bloqueio da Venezuela acabou sendo resolvido por arbitragem, a Venezuela acabou sendo forçada a pagar várias dívidas para os países europeus, mas nós temos aí uma articulação de direito internacional interessante que circulou de maneira ampla na época, né? Eu não quero com isso daqui endeusar o Drago, que é esse brother aqui. Essa é a foto que está na porta dos arquivos históricos lá em Buenos Aires. Né? A ideia com essa pesquisa não é buscar heróis latino-americanos, mas, como eu disse a vocês, por meio de determinadas interpretações de direito internacional, né, que foram feitas por juristas latino-americanos, no caso, homens brancos, tá, gente? Eu estou muito consciente, né, de que esse trabalho aborda interpretações de pessoas de elite da América Latina. A gente tem, por meio, né, desse olhar de direito internacional, a possibilidade de abordar uma questão mais ampla e mais outra questão que me parece absolutamente fundamental na América Latina, que é a questão da dívida externa. A gente tem aqui, isso rodou, claro, os Estados Unidos, né, que na época não fizeram parte dessa empreitada intervencionista, então foi um bloqueio liderado por países europeus, mas como é que chama isso, gente? Cartoon? Charge, isso. Nessa charge, a gente tem o venezuelano falando, olha aí os europeus, né, falando com o tio Sam, olha aí os europeus vindo atacar a gente, cadê essa doutrina Monroe aí que vocês falaram que ia proteger? Aí o tio Sam fala, filhinho, a doutrina Monroe vai te proteger, mas não das suas dívidas, né? Então, nós temos aí um momento de mudança geopolítica muito grande, né, de potências europeias para o imperialismo estadunidense, e algo que o professor Okafor também menciona, né, países mais fracos, claro, no meio dessa briga, e de fato a Venezuela acabou sendo responsabilizada e teve que pagar, né, se obrigou a pagar várias obrigações pecuniárias nesse caso. Gente, esse é um tema que continua, né, mas como a gente conversou hoje de manhã e agora à noite, olhar para a história, claro, nos permite iluminar o presente, né, entender como determinadas questões continuam a informar os problemas da nossa região, e esse esforço historiográfico, claro, é muito importante para a gente poder entender, né, essas continuidades. Esse me parece ser um caso de continuidade muito, muito forte. O meu segundo exemplo aqui, meu terceiro tema que eu gostaria de mencionar, ele é construído a partir da análise de um segundo jurista internacionalista que eu estou estudando. Dessa vez é o jurista internacionalista mexicano Isidro Fabela, o jurista da Revolução Mexicana. E o que está em jogo, né, nesse momento, me parece ser, aí sim, não é só a esperança, né, no Estado, mas a fé, para usar também a distinção que o professor Okafor acabou de fazer entre hope e faith, mas é uma certa fé, né, na possibilidade do Estado nacional latino-americano conseguir trazer efetivas mudanças, né, na nossa realidade de ex-colônias, né, transformar efetivamente essa condição de colônia que nós tínhamos ainda muito, muito forte, né? A Revolução Mexicana, claro, é absolutamente complexa e são várias forças sociais que estão em jogo, mas nós temos uma parte aí, né, que desemboca na Constituição mexicana de 1917, o direito é um aspecto bastante relevante, saliente nesse movimento, e nós temos toda uma regulamentação do novo Estado mexicano, baseada numa Constituição bastante progressista para a época, né? A gente costuma colocar a Constituição mexicana e a Constituição de Weimar como as constituições que tratam de direitos sociais e econômicos. Especialmente aqui, para mim, me interessa o artigo 27 da Constituição mexicana e a questão da propriedade dos recursos naturais, que nessa Constituição foi vedado aos estrangeiros terem propriedade sobre os recursos naturais do subsolo. A questão em jogo aqui era justamente a nacionalização do petróleo mexicano e como impedir, né, que esse recurso natural continuasse sendo explorado, especialmente por companhias estadunidenses. Então, a aposta aqui nessa empreitada da Revolução Mexicana e me utilizando da interpretação jurídica aqui das interpretações desse jurista internacionalista que foi o Isidro Fabela, é justamente pensar em algo que, né, não só na nossa região, mas né, em vários outros lugares do mundo, mas na nossa particularidade aqui, a fé no Estado, né, como esse elemento modernizador da nossa condição colonial, e muitas vezes né, a gente não atenta para o próprio colonialismo interno que foi perpetuado por esse Estado moderno latino-americano. Então aqui eu acho que nós temos um terceiro tema absolutamente relevante para pensar o direito internacional desde uma perspectiva latino-americana, que é justamente analisar em maiores detalhes, né, como se deu essas empreitadas modernizantes, né, aqui estamos falando dos anos 30, né, essas empreitadas modernizantes, e o papel do direito e também do direito internacional. Eu não vou ter tempo de entrar nos detalhes aqui, mas o papel do direito e do direito internacional nessa tentativa, né, reformista que tem o Estado como grande foco de ação. Então, gente, estou indo mega rápido, eu sei, mas a ideia talvez hoje é menos entrar no detalhe de cada uma das interpretações, mas pontuar alguns temas, né, que podem vir para a superfície quando a gente adota uma sensibilidade terceiro-mundista em direito internacional. O Fabela foi o delegado mexicano na Liga das Nações, ele tem uma atuação muito interessante sobre a Guerra Civil Espanhola. Essa é uma história super comprida, mas a grande preocupação nesse momento é exportar uma visão de um México pós-revolucionário, com pujança econômica, e um país que pode agora ser um ator confiável e com voz firme no cenário internacional. Então o México se apropria desses espaços, entre eles a Liga das Nações, para mostrar o resultado da Revolução Mexicana como algo positivo, robusto e de sucesso. Então é muito interessante como local e internacional se articulam, né, por meio dessa atuação mexicana na Liga das Nações. É aqui que entra o direito internacional de maneira mais forte. Eu queria falar um pouquinho mais desse terceiro jurista internacionalista que eu tenho me ocupado também. Publiquei também com o João, publicamos um texto sobre ele, chama-se até O Advogado do Terceiro Mundo. Esse é um terceiro momento da pesquisa, novamente me utilizando da interpretação de um jurista internacionalista latino-americano para pensar nas questões mais estruturais, né, que estão relacionadas à nossa região. A questão aqui é analisar o trabalho do Eduardo Novoa Monreal, que foi o assessor jurídico do Allende no projeto de nacionalização do cobre no governo Allende, né, portanto, antes do golpe do Pinochet, um momento bastante progressista, né, na América Latina, e a tentativa justamente de subverter, né, de tentar alterar como se dava a exploração econômica desse recurso natural absolutamente fundamental para a economia mexicana. Ele, como advogado, vai estruturar tanto do ponto de vista constitucional essa nacionalização, quanto depois ele vai ser o advogado chileno que vai defender o Chile em arbitragem na Europa, que foi promovida pelas empresas que exploravam o cobre no Chile e que buscavam justamente uma compensação, né, por essa... Eles queriam ser indenizados, né, as empresas que exploravam o cobre falaram, não, você quer nacionalizar, nacionaliza, mas me paga, né, porque nós não vamos aqui simplesmente terminar esse contrato e ficar a ver navios, né. O Novoa Monreal foi quem elaborou a defesa chilena nessa arbitragem que aconteceu em Paris. Mais do que isso, eu queria chamar a atenção de vocês que nós temos vários críticos, né, aqui na nossa região. Esse é um dos livros mais interessantes que eu tenho, que topei aí nos últimos tempos, né, o Direito como Obstáculo ao Câmbio Social, em que o Novoa Monreal justamente articula, né, a sua análise de um direito tal como ele era ensinado e praticado na América Latina desde uma perspectiva mais formalista e doutrinária, como ele seria problemático, né, para se pensar projetos mais progressistas de transformação. No caso, estamos no contexto depois ele entra muito fortemente como assessor do Allende, então a gente está num momento bem específico de um projeto político de transformação, acho, né, mais radical, e, portanto, o direito pode contribuir para esse processo ou pode atrapalhar, né? Então ele tem uma análise bastante específica sobre essa questão e publica também sobre a questão do cobre, né, especificamente. Ele vai discutir a questão, ele publicou muito, né, o Novoa Monreal, e vai discutir como o direito internacional trataria, né, dessa questão diante da nacionalização de recursos naturais, quais seriam as regras de direito internacional para a questão do pagamento de compensações, né? Então, isso daqui é praticamente como se fossem os memoriais dele na arbitragem. A gente vê o livro como se fosse a defesa, né, que ele fez em Paris, diante do processo arbitral que foi movido pelas empresas que exploravam o cobre no Chile. E aí, toda uma análise bastante sofisticada de direito internacional, ele conclui que as nacionalizações, né, veja que ele não está falando em expropriação do cobre, mas que a nacionalização seria algo totalmente permitido em direito internacional. Não apenas os países de terceiro mundo estariam fazendo, mas países europeus nacionalizaram, enfim, vários setores da sua economia em momentos diversos na história. Portanto, o direito internacional permitiria esse movimento, porém, não haveria regra de direito internacional clara sobre a questão de uma compensação efetiva, justa e devida, né, como pleiteavam as empresas que exploravam o cobre, né, queriam ser compensados de maneira a realmente reverter as perdas econômicas, né, com essa transformação de política no Estado chileno. Então, gente, enfim, eu falei... Deixei mais coisas aqui, depois também, Tati, a gente pode circular os slides, mas vejam que o que a gente tem aqui em discussão nesse momento, né, é justamente o movimento dos países de terceiro mundo apostando na ideia de uma soberania permanente dos seus recursos naturais. Então, basta de exploração de recursos por outros países, seja diretamente, seja pela empreitada colonial, seja pela dominação de multinacionais, mas uma aposta, né, de que o exercício da soberania sobre recursos naturais seria algo que traria benefícios para os países do terceiro mundo nesse momento. a gente sabe que muitos projetos e utopias falharam, né? Esse foi um dos que também não teve maiores sucessos do ponto de vista de uma transformação da ordem econômica internacional de forma substantiva. Mas me parece importante relembrar alguns momentos em que a imaginação política de juristas internacionalistas, né, claro, não isoladamente, mas em conjunto com questões políticas importantes, pensaram arranjos de direito internacional que possibilitariam uma transformação mais substantiva no contexto da América Latina. Esse foi um momento importante. Não acho que existam muitos, para falar a verdade. Me parece que a gente tem assim alguns lampejos de imaginação política, né, meio fora da caixa. Eu acho que esse daqui é um deles. A Revolução Mexicana certamente foi outro. E me parece que nos dias que correm a gente anda meio sem imaginação, né? Parece que um pouco, de alguma forma, o neoliberalismo parece não ter alternativas, a forma como a gente vive, né, nesse planeta, a distribuição de bens materiais e espirituais no mundo parece congelada, né, como se fosse impossível uma transformação. E eu fiz essa pergunta para o João hoje, né, então é melhor falar abertamente. É claro que relembrar essas histórias, a gente precisa analisá-las com muito detalhe, né, concordo contigo. Mas não, né, por mera curiosidade historiográfica, mas justamente porque a gente está pensando no presente, em que a gente tem um contexto de uma região, a região mais desigual do mundo, né, uma concentração de renda que segue brutal, né, algo que a gente não experimentava há décadas atrás. A gente tem hoje muita concentração de renda na mão de poucos. E parece que os nossos espaços, né, para pensar transformação, para pensar um mundo diferente, estão ficando muito apertados, né, muito reduzidos. Então, analisar em detalhes um pouco dessa história me parece algo importante. Estou deixando de fora aqui temas absolutamente relevantes, né, por exemplo, a questão de povos indígenas, né, como se deu a questão da escravidão na nossa região. Então, são outros temas que também precisam, né, fazem parte aqui do contexto latino-americano. Então, eu queria só ilustrar para vocês, né, de como, de novo, Tueil pode propiciar uma pesquisa absolutamente enraizada no contexto latino-americano, em diálogo com os nossos próprios Latin critics, né, os nossos críticos da região, porque nós temos, não é só os positivistas chatonildos, mas, né, a gente tem gente que falou coisa muito interessante no passado e que está falando no presente também, né? Então, acho que tem muito trabalho por ser feito, muito trabalho mesmo. Eu falo isso para pessoas mais próximas. Eu não aguento mais estudar gringo, estou agora absolutamente focada, e aqui, não Tueil, né, mas os europeus chatões lá e tudo mais, totalmente focada em entender esse histórico latino-americano, né? Tem muito trabalho de pesquisa para ser feito, para que de alguma forma a gente possa praticar o direito internacional, talvez não de maneira institucionalmente engajada, como o professor Okafor mencionou. Eu não tenho essa experiência, mas na sala de aula, com alunas, alunos, grupos de pesquisa e discussões, né, no espaço público, pensar o direito internacional num outro lugar e como uma forma de atacar os problemas da América Latina. Então, quis hoje só enunciar alguns deles: intervenção, regionalismo, essa fé no Estado modernizante, dívida externa, como certas questões persistentes aqui na nossa região, questões que me parecem mais claras quando a gente adota uma sensibilidade de terceiro mundo no nosso campo. Muito bem, espero que não tenha sido muito comprido, Tati. Não? Tá bom. Gente, eu queria terminar com um convite a todas e todos vocês. Essa é a página da Tueil Review, da revista que vem publicando textos que tem uma articulação da literatura de Tueil desde diversas perspectivas. A página é tueilr.com. Nós somos uma revista de acesso aberto, né? As publicações enfim, estão disponíveis para todos para fazer o download. A gente está indo para o nosso 4º número, agora em 2023. Nós publicamos tanto textos longos, né, um número por ano, com artigos longos, todos são submetidos à revisão por pares, a gente segue tudo bonitinho, mas nós não somos uma revista Oxford University Press, Cambridge, qualquer coisa, mas tudo é feito na base da capacidade do conselho editorial. São pessoas que trabalham já, né, com as perspectivas de 2AO há bastante tempo. Então esse é um convite para que vocês considerem a submissão de trabalhos de vocês. Nós não temos restrição quanto à submissão de trabalhos de estudantes, acho que isso é bem importante de falar. Algumas revistas não permitem, né, a submissão de estudantes. E não só trabalhos longos, a gente também publica reflections, que são ensaios mais curtos, de 2.500 palavras a 3.000 palavras. Então, se vocês tiverem textos curtos também, algum tema que estejam pensando e que ainda não deu para transformar num artigo, mas que querem já publicar algumas ideias, a gente está super aberto para publicação. Vocês podem encontrar o nosso statement em várias línguas, né? Qual que é a nossa linha de publicação de trabalhos, né? É claro que a gente parte do pressuposto que o direito internacional não é uma disciplina progressista tradicionalmente, né? Que existem problemas que são gerados pelo direito internacional e a gente está interessado em tanto entender essas questões mais problemáticas, como também perspectivas talvez mais emancipatórias, mas de toda forma uma abordagem crítica ao direito internacional que dialogue com as sensibilidades das pessoas que, né, de alguma forma, ou estão no sul global, não é algo geográfico, né, mas podem estar no sul do norte né, como a gente já viu aqui com o professor Okafor. Então, gostaria de reforçar, deem uma olhada na nossa página, os textos estão todos disponíveis para download, sintam-se convidadas e convidados para mandar os textos para a gente. Muito obrigada e vamos dar conta de perguntas. Obrigada, Thay.
Muito obrigada, professora Fábia, pela excelente exposição. Cabe agora a mim fazer uma conexão e que possamos falar primeiramente sobre essas duas falas. Eu vou fazê-la em inglês, assim o professor Okafor could follow us also in English, so I'm gonna now address this panel in English so you can understand it. So it is very interesting when we come to think about the connections of both lectures, right? For instance, Fabio was talking about how we had actually an intervention in the early 20th century back in Venezuela, and how that, for example, is a type of sanction. And while Professor Okafor was also talking about sanctions in his latest blog contribution, talking about how can we think about sanctions and how sanctions actually should be regulated by international law, while we have, for instance, international humanitarian law very regulated, and both cause the same sort of violations at the end. And then we come to think, Fabio was talking to us about how the situation actually repeated itself in Latin America throughout time. For instance, when you were talking about all the sovereign debts that we have had throughout the latest century, and talking about even the 70s and the 80s and the 90s here in Latin America, and then how, for instance, that reflects actually an imposition of the global north, and how the global north keeps on telling us how to act and telling us how to react to that, to a sovereign debt, for instance, situation. And how international law works on that. International law actually is the mechanism through which we can impose sanctions to some countries and others do not feel or do not receive any actions, do not receive any sanctions in the global north, right? So there are many connections. Here we have a lecture talking about the points of the third world approaches to international law, and one talking about the examples of these interventions and these mechanisms that sustain the international coloniality, the modern international law, the imperial international law throughout time. So it is quite interesting when we come to think that this is not something that we only feel in other states, such as in Asia or in Africa, but also here in Latin America, to a neighboring country, right? And then what I come to think is that Professor Okafor was talking about how TWAIO is a cosmopolitan project and how third world approaches to international law can help us think on solutions to these sort of issues. But then we normally have an issue concerning third world approaches to international law, which is every time we talk about TWAIO, there is always a person saying, okay, but TWAIO only criticizes international law and does not propose anything. This is what we hear all the time when we talk about TWAIO. But what is the proposition? What are you proposing with third world approaches to international law? You are not creating anything. But we have to look to history and understand the past and how can it affect the present and the future. Otherwise, if we don't realize the past was a colonial and imperial past, we cannot understand the problems of the future and maybe think about other forms of creating law in the future, right? So this is always, for instance, my reaction to people when people say, okay, TWAIO does not contribute. Yes, indeed, we contribute to look at the past, to understand the present, and maybe to furnish other alternatives for the future, right? And I wanted to actually ask you for your reaction to this common proposition of people saying, okay, but what are you proposing with a third world approach to international law? And this is something that is, I believe, something we have to think also, because we offer hope. I agree with Carrie Mickelson. I agree with you, Professor. And I agree that we have also to look to our experiences to understand international law and to think about other possibilities. Nevertheless, I wanted to have you also react to that. How do you answer that? Because this is something that we always have to answer when we are in a global north space debating on international law. So this would be my question to you both. So we can start our discussions with this. So, would you like to start?
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. First, thanks to Fabian for that presentation. Even if though I couldn't understand, I felt it. You know how you feel it, right? You know, like African Americans, you say, I'm feeling you. You know, so I definitely felt it. I could make out some of the stuff. Some of it was in English. So, and then the sort of the translation, brief translation from Tatiana was excellent. It confirmed and reaffirmed that solidarity that I felt with what you were saying. But thank you so much, Professor Tatiana, for that. You are indeed correct. It's often the question that arises, and it has always been also an internal debate within TWIL itself. So, long time ago, 2000 and something, early 2000s, D.S. Chimney, who's now retired, wrote something actually on this exact question, and he was actually almost saying the same thing. He says, it's great, I mean, his famous book was an entire thorough critique of international law, very fundamental, but he's saying that we also have to now begin to say, here is what we want Of course, it will vary depending on country, depending on the topic, right, and so on in detail. But here are things that a critic might lead to. Here is our vision of a kind of programmatic agenda, as they say. So my reaction to that is, as you said, first of all, three reactions. First is that critique is doing, as you pointed out. If you don't, as you said, understand what in the first place is happening, your solutions are going to be problematic. They're not going to be successful. And, well, are we surprised we have a messy world? Right? So we have to first understand what is going wrong, right? And the first generation of Twitters is almost unfair, because if you look at the first generation, it's not just the first generation of Twitter, say 50s, 60s, early 70s, they were all diplomats, judges, foreign ministers. They were doing. But did anybody pay attention either? Which brings me actually to my 10th profession. If we propose, will you accept? Right? It's not as if, oh, okay, what is worth saying, propose it, and it to be embraced immediately. So it's often sort of a bit disingenuous, right? While I understand the question, because I'm also a doer myself, but a lot of times it doesn't come from a good political place.
No.
It is a delegitimating kind of question, right? I understand it when it's genuine, because the first generation, and Tony talks about this in that piece, the AGL thing, recent piece, we all, perhaps that's why the sort of later generations said, you know what, let's step back a bit and understand why NIEO was, almost, killed. Why did they succeed in killing the new international economic order, right? How did global power move? And then circle it and try to, there were things that are still alive in it, but they killed a lot of it, right? Right to development is still alive. UNCTAD, UN Conference on Trade and Development, is still alive. Still produces alternative trade and development ideas and practices and all that to this day. There are a lot of things that are still there. Common heritage of humankind is still there. Common but differentiated responsibilities. There's a lot of good thought, that is still alive, kicking, influencing practical things, including even in the World Trade Organization. So it is not that Will has never proposed a vision of the good global society. It is that oftentimes when it does so, it's poo-pooed away, not taken seriously at all. But there's always a ray of light over the log arc. If you have followed the negotiations, for example, over the binding treaty on the right to development, the day that basically third world states forced the Human Rights Council to start negotiating that treaty, the EU walked out physically from the room, right? But they're back. Last year, they came back to the table and they said, we can actually have a binding treaty, but let's now talk about how it might look, right? That is massive from the stance they've adopted all this while, right? That's massive. It doesn't mean we have a treaty yet, but there will be a treaty. The issue is, how will it look like? Which, in international society, is a fair point. It's always a product of compromise and negotiation anyway. So there are things that have been on the ground. Binding treaty on business and human rights. Don't do unilateral interventions all the time for our oil. These are concrete proposals that have been on the ground since 100 years that global power has not quite accepted, right? So it's not true, I'm not saying you're not doing them, that TWIL doesn't produce anything. We're academics to begin with, TWILers. We're not necessarily talking about diplomats or anything like that. We're academics. We first have to understand the problem and then begin to, and a lot of tool scholars have proposed many things in different contexts, and when given a chance, the proposal for a commission of inquiry into the U.S. Mind you, commissions of inquiry are reserved for the bad states. That's why the U.S. brought out sanctions, withdrawal of aid, all kinds of intimidation tactics to stop a commission of inquiry on the killing of George Floyd and killing of, shooting police brutality on blacks. Not that it wasn't warranted, but they didn't want to be among the few states that were subject to a commission of inquiry, right? The people who say Twill has no proposal, when my good friend Tedai, Special Rapporteur, and others within this other people, sort of like minds, pushed that and got the African states to do that, that was the proposal for us doing something differently. The first time African Americans asked for the UN to intervene over their being lynched and killed was W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1930s. Sorry, 1940s. No, 30s. Then later, they asked again. Eleanor Roosevelt said it was garbage, rubbish. This is a great Eleanor Roosevelt. That would tell you how much Twill or Twill-like work is up against. This is this is somebody who actually marched for civil rights, but said the petition it went too far, it was garbage, it was all that, right? So it tells you the resistance for global power is immense, right? And that sometimes is why it almost seems futile to many of us to begin to propose these solutions, because the question is, if you propose them, what are they going to do? Nobody is going to take it seriously, right? But I think that we must continue to critique, understand, expose it. But if you're so minded, as Nigerians say, if the spirit leads you, and you think there's actually a workable solution, especially when you wear your hat of praxis, and there's a workable solution, why not? Like she did, and it changed the politics. Now we have an experiment that studies this issue. Now it's not directed solely at the U.S. It can go to any country, but it highlights that issue because for 100 years, as if these lynchings and police brutality don't happen, and they're just a matter of domestic jurisdiction. When in fact, if that happened, then that country will be seen as a matter of domestic jurisdiction. So. That is what I would say for now on that issue. A, Twillers have been proposing solutions. B, we are primarily scholars and we're doing our job. And if we end up proposing solutions, then fine. But it's not a good critique to say we don't propose solutions alone. Yeah.
No, what to say after this? No, no, Obi, just so that this don't get too crazy, that I speak in one language and you in the other. So normally, I find what you said just it is a delegitimizing position for sure. No. Well, at least for myself, I don't have your experience in engaging in praxis, no? So I teach, so I normally when people, but you're not proposing anything, blah, 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 I put myself in the very, look, we need to understand the problem first, and I think this is what academics should do. So I'm not an activist, I'm not working with social movements, my thing is happens in the classroom. So what I can do, the best I can do actually, is to somehow present some sort of more nuanced, rich in detail narrative of how international law lands in Latin America, because that's my commitment right now. So big normative pictures for the world, not here. And I think this is what critique means, to somehow open our minds and then open space for political imagination with better narratives and more accurate and detailed narratives. So vamos não falar com essas pessoas, let's not just talk to them, these boring people, no, I mean, especially in these conferences in the global north, they do happen a lot, no, dwellers, let's talk among us, this is why it's so nice to have you.
Nesse momento, então, eu pergunto se nós temos algum questionamento, professor Gabriel.
A professora Fábio falou uma frase que me chocou um pouco, que ela falou assim, alguns outros temas que ela não ia abordar hoje, e um dos temas era povos indígenas. E aí me chocou porque era exatamente o que eu perguntei, eu falei, você não vai? Falei pra Karina, falei que não vai ficar de fora hoje.
Não deve.
Na verdade, assim, não, eu falei, estou brincando, obviamente.
Não.
E aí, na verdade, assim, em 2018, o Fukurai escreveu um texto sobre as abordagens do quarto mundo do direito internacional. E ele até fez uma mudança para original approaches, né, mais lawful approaches, para aplicar, eu acho que é para aplicar dentro da nossa realidade, pensar o quarto mundo a partir da América Latina também. Eu acho que o quarto mundo é ainda mais adequado, porque a gente tem outras populações, né, que não são povos indígenas, como, né, se a gente for pensar em povos tradicionais da bacia do Rio São Francisco, quilombolas, né? Então, acho que pensar em quarto mundo é ainda mais aplicável para a gente. E aí, diante dessas dificuldades que o quarto mundo possui para poder ter, se a gente fala de terceiro mundo, quando ele propõe a ideia de abordagens do quarto mundo, ele está propondo um outro referencial teórico. Na verdade, ele está querendo que a TUEIL também trabalhe a respeito disso, trabalhe com essas temáticas, para que ele abranger ainda mais essa perspectiva. E aí, pensando hoje nos problemas que a gente possui, principalmente no Brasil, quando a gente está em semana onde foi aprovada, né, a PL na Câmara sobre o marco temporal, o que sobra, assim, às vezes, de que forma a gente consegue atuar e como pensar isso a partir, né, dessas abordagens. Acho que isso é acho que essa é uma pergunta que tem me feito muito, assim, que eu tenho questionado muito, porque a partir do momento em que a gente deixa de trabalhar com as perspectivas dos povos indígenas, eu acho que a gente não consegue, sem pensar nos povos indígenas, muitas vezes a gente mantém ainda uma dominação que é até uma ideia até de colonialidade interna. Eu acho que eu tive várias na verdade, assim, eu tive que selecionar bem a pergunta que eu ia fazer, porque tem muita coisa que eu queria perguntar, mas eu realmente queria te ouvir um pouco a respeito disso. Eu escrevi em inglês também, você traduziu? Então não precisa.
Obrigada, Gabriel. Não, eu concordo contigo em absoluto, né? Por isso que eu fiquei no começo falando que isso era hoje aqui era vamos dizer, uma lista exemplificativa, de alguns temas, e que várias questões estão de fora, né? Por isso que eu acho que a gente tem muito trabalho para fazer, muito, né? Tati, Bianca e Natália escreveram um texto, publicaram recentemente sobre a questão do quarto mundo, né? Então, claro, é muito trabalho para fazer, para ficar falando de ius constitucional e comum e essas piscirogas por aí, né? Então, eu estou brincando, mas para dizer, né? Essa pesquisa não dá conta, né, de todas as problemáticas e todas as questões. Esse é o tema, né, isso aqui é a pesquisa de pós-doutorado que eu estou fazendo. Tenho absoluta consciência das limitações, né? Estou olhando para juristas brancos de elite da América Latina que estão ocupando postos nesse Estado que reproduz esquemas de dominação internamente, né, que reproduz a colonialidade interna. Então, por isso que eu falei, né, a gente não está diante de heróis, lá tinha o Drago, meu herói, não dá para falar uma coisa dessa. Enquanto a gente sabe o que aconteceu qual foi a política, né, do Estado argentino para povos originários, e, enfim, isso é uma história que se repete em vários outros lugares na América Latina. Agora, Gabriel, eu não estudo esse tema, né, mas eu vou te falar que eu esqueci dessa foto, que era como eu queria terminar essa fala. Um dos exercícios mais magníficos que eu vi recentemente para pensar essa questão, né, de como a gente pode, de alguma forma, desde o direito, né, porque afinal, pelo menos a minha formação não vai muito além disso, né, eu acho magnífico estudos antropológicos, etnografias, mas não tenho formação nisso. Claro que a gente dialoga com outros saberes, mas reconheço os limites, né, até onde o direito pode ir. Mas, de toda forma, foi muito... eu não sei, acho que essa ópera só ficou em São Paulo. Por enquanto, eu vi a remontagem, né, do Guarani com a reconceituação do Ailton Krenak no Teatro Municipal, depois de 1000 anos e tudo mais. E foi um dos exercícios mais magníficos que eu vi de poder problematizar uma peça tão antiga, né, eu digo assim, não só a peça ópera, mas o próprio livro, né, em que ela foi baseada, num momento romântico no Brasil, de criação desse mito indígena, né, que se une com a portuguesa, no caso, porque era uma mulher, e aí nós temos a fundação do Brasil, os modernistas caíram em cima depois, do José de Alencar e tal. Mas foi o Krenak que fez essa montagem. E foi uma das coisas mais geniais que eu já vi. Então, assim, Gabriel, eu acho que, honestamente, pensando, né, o que é essa perspectiva crítica, né, eu te confesso que eu tenho muito receio por desconfiar e ter certeza, na verdade, da minha própria limitação ao enxergar esses problemas. Eu não consigo, pelo menos agora, na fotografia de hoje, de onde eu me encontro, né, uma formação bem tradicional em Direito Internacional, Tueio chegou bem depois, essas questões vieram, né, bati muito a cabeça na minha vida, não entendia milhares dessas complicações por muito tempo, mas eu prefiro dar um passo atrás ao invés de partir para grandes elaborações. Isso não quer dizer inviabilizar a questão indígena, mas eu tenho, obviamente, dúvida do que eu posso dizer. Estou pensando no teu... como é que um mini curso, queria saber o nome direitinho, falar o workshop. No teu workshop amanhã, né? Como é vista a própria questão estratégica, por exemplo, da utilização do vocabulário de direitos humanos pelos próprios povos indígenas no Brasil, né? Então, eu estou num lugar de escuta aqui, né? Então, de aprendizado, na verdade, por saber, primeiro, das deficiências do lugar que eu ocupo, que é de privilégio, né, de uma pessoa branca e tudo mais, e depois das próprias limitações do vocabulário jurídico para certas transformações, né? Posso só mais um comentário rápido? Eu passei muito tempo na Austrália, né? Foi onde eu fiz o pós-doutorado, e lá não era o vocabulário, eles têm uma deficiência muito grande com relação à presença de direitos humanos no ordenamento australiano, né? Então, os aborígenes australianos articularam o direito internacional como vocabulário para tentar chegar num acordo com a Austrália branca, falando, olha, pessoal, o negócio é o seguinte, nós queremos ocupar o mesmo território que vocês. É isso que a gente quer. Eles fizeram uma grande reunião em volta lá de Uluru, né, que é aquele grande marco, é um lugar fundamental para a cosmovisão aborígene. Várias nações se reuniram, escreveram uma declaração e propuseram um tratado internacional para a Austrália branca, dizendo, olha, vamos conviver no mesmo território. Não celebraram, nem quiseram continuar a conversa, era um primeiro-ministro bastante conservador e tudo mais. Então, o direito como ferramental estratégico ou tático, a depender do seu objetivo de a curto prazo, médio prazo, longo prazo, vai oferecer saídas muito diversas, né? Então, eu acho que nós precisamos de muita pesquisa. Eu não tenho, com essa fala de hoje, não quero que você fique chocado, porque não é uma ausência, não quero saber desse assunto, muito ao contrário, mas é assumir as limitações de algo que não vai dar conta de uma questão de todos os problemas latino-americanos, e a gente vai continuando essa lista, né? Por isso que eu digo, para mim, pelo menos, deu de ficar falando de teses europeias, constitucionalismo comum, ou seja lá o que for. Nós temos milhares de problemas para lidar aqui e pensar em articulações produtivas, interessantes, criativas com o direito internacional. Então, eu acho que está na mesa. E, no meu caso, acho que muito mais para aprender com os movimentos sociais e com os movimentos indígenas que estão na batalha brutal desse país mega conservador que a gente vive, né? Nesse momento, right here, right now. Então, por favor, não se trata de uma exclusão ou de uma desvalorização de questões, mas é isso. Acho que a gente tem bastante coisa interessante para fazer como jurista.
Vai fazer de vez em vez ou faz um bloco?
Eu pensei, na verdade, em fazer então, Letícia.
Boa noite. Obrigada de novo, né, por essa oportunidade de estar aqui. A minha pergunta vai ser para a Fábia também, porque eu não consigo elaborar uma pergunta em inglês aqui, infelizmente. Mas que eu achei muito interessante, eu queria ouvir mais quando você trouxe principalmente a parte, né, do Estado e a modernidade ali, e uma fala que teve tanto de manhã quanto agora à noite sobre, e tanto na sua fala quanto do professor Okafor, sobre isso, da gente conseguir, né, meio que hackear as coisas, olhando a história também, o passado, né, para aí a gente poder criar, né, alternativas, uma vacina, né, perante as situações assim. E você trouxe temas como Estado, região e aí o que eu queria te perguntar e ouvir mais, porque do meu ponto de vista há essa quase uma estadolatria no sentido de todas as nossas saídas ou todo o nosso imaginário, a nossa imaginação passar por essa figura do Estado. Que dentro, né, do que eu venho pesquisado e pensando, eu não acho que o Estado reproduza a colonialidade. O Estado é, de certa maneira, a própria manifestação da colonialidade dentro do nosso contexto de um país que foi colonizado. Né, dialogando muito também com o que o Slava e a Parrúdia fala, né, o direito internacional como criador do Estado para os lugares que foram colonizados. E aí, frente, né, à situação que a gente se encontra hoje, pensando tanto o Brasil como a região, a gente teve, né, da década de 90 para cá, uma onda progressista, depois a gente teve esse retorno totalmente conservador, e agora que no Brasil a gente tem no governo nacional, mas não no executivo, né, não no legislativo, essa volta progressista, só que aí fica a dúvida para mim, e como que esse olhar para o passado pode nos informar agora? Inclusive porque, não me lembro se foi essa semana ou semana passada, quando o Lula vai pensar América do Sul, ele fala uma América do Sul desenvolvida. Sim. E aí sendo que, inclusive tem vários estudos falando, né, da defasagem da onda progressista quando ela começa a compartilhar esse léxico desenvolvimentista, a manutenção desse imaginário colonialista desenvolvimentista. E o Estado sendo esse papel, assim. Então, também retomando um pouco da fala de manhã, né, que falou, a gente entende a necessidade que teve da gente pautar o Estado independente, né, de Bandung também, né, pegando para o nosso lado terceiro mundista, da gente ter que ter passado pela figura do Estado e a afirmação da independência, da soberania e tudo mais. Mas já que a gente está aqui agora, olhando para isso, eu fico um pouco assim, ainda dessa continuidade da gente apostar nessa mesma saída, sabe? Aí eu queria te ouvir em relação a isso, porque você trouxe exatamente isso, né? A região, como a gente imagina a região e a figura do Estado, essa estadolatria, né? Que, do meu ponto de vista, é problemático, assim. Então, é uma curiosidade mesmo para te ouvir mais sobre isso, sabe?
É para responder, Tati? Quer pegar mais ou Letícia simultânea. Ah, eu vi. Não, ótimo. Não. Letícia, super obrigada pela tua pergunta e concordo em absoluto contigo, né? Me parece, pelo menos olhando esse momento da Revolução Mexicana em específico, né? E por conta do estudo sobre dívida externa, né? Que é algo que marcou inclusive o nosso momento de independência. Me parece que sim, que a gente tem uma linha de continuidade muito forte, né? Uma pergunta latino-americana, me parece, por excelência. Como deixamos de ser colônia? Como é possível? O que a gente vai fazer para deixar de ser colônia? E aí, para responder essa pergunta, pelo menos do que eu tenho visto até agora, os horizontes eram mesmo um pouco limitados. E aí, enfim, pode me chamar de anacronista, mas as alternativas parecem que não eram das mais variadas do ponto de vista da forma de organização política das nossas comunidades aqui, né? Então, eu acho que de modernização que a gente tem desde o final do século XIX, passa por movimentos mais radicais, um pouquinho mais revolucionários aí na primeira metade do XX, a gente vem com o discurso desenvolvimentista que me parece ser uma continuidade muito grande, né, de como deixamos para trás essa condição de colônia. Nas possibilidades aí de transformação, sim, o Estado é um sujeito muito importante, né, como forma de organização da comunidade política. A transformação parece que só pode ser concretizada via Estado e, portanto, isso deixa diversas coisas de fora, né? A própria pergunta, né, como a gente deixa de ser colônia, nos leva, bom, então o que você quer, América Latina, ou comunidades políticas da América Latina? A gente quer ser igual à Europa? Nós temos uma régua de mais desenvolvidos e menos desenvolvidos, cujo o ponto de chegada seria, né, o desenvolvimento dos países do norte global, que a riqueza toda é baseada numa roubalheira, né, numa exploração brutal de pessoas e roubalheira de recursos naturais desde todo sempre, das colônias, né, justamente dos países que tiveram a experiência do colonialismo, né, e portanto algo que, na real, esse desenvolvimento, ele não é alcançável, né? Nós nunca vamos conseguir chegar, se a gente pensar nessa régua linear, estrita, né? Não, vamos desenvolver. Esse modelo é impossível, porque nós não temos mais como roubar tanto de recursos que foram roubados das colônias, escravizar pessoas e toda a violência do projeto colonial e imperialista de maneira mais ampla, né? Então, portanto, eu acho que eu concordo contigo, né? O Estado parece estar como ator político nessa linha de continuidade. Tenho dúvidas se é possível ter alguma coisa mais transformadora, mais radical, por meio desse aparato burocrático institucional que segue mobilizando, eu concordo de novo contigo, né? Por exemplo, o vocabulário desenvolvimentista, né? Ou seja, vamos de novo chegar uma perspectiva extrativista de uso de recursos naturais, de belo monte, desse tipo de empreitada. É isso que nós vamos continuar vendo, por exemplo, nesse momento pós-Bolsonaro, né? Acho que a gente precisa ter esse questionamento muito claro. Então, de toda maneira, do ponto de vista da pesquisa, e aí pensando numa empreitada mais modesta, né, de alguém, de novo, eu não sou uma ativista e não estou no meio de lutas, então, de alguma maneira, eu não estou enfrentando, né, na linha de frente os problemas que muitos grupos e movimentos estão enfrentando. Mas me parece importante entender em maiores detalhes, para seguir o que o professor Okafor falou, né, qual é essa... de maneira rigorosa, academicamente embasada, usando o direito internacional, que é a minha área, qual que foi a grande aposta no Estado, como isso foi concretizado, pensando, essa que me parece ser uma pergunta latino-americana muito forte. Como deixamos de ser colônia? Como fazemos isso e qual é o objetivo? Como deixamos de ser colônia não necessariamente é algo que vai levar ao pensamento decolonial, à transformação, muito ao contrário. É uma continuidade de determinados, né, de novo, um modo extrativista, né, de utilização de recursos naturais, que segue sendo levado a cabo, né, não sou eu que falo isso, a gente tem, né, o livro clássico da Sandra Parruja, que fala sobre essa questão do desenvolvimento, esse desenvolver para quê? Né? É possível continuar pensando em hidrelétricas do jeito que a gente pensa, etc. e etc. Então, de maneira mais modesta, eu diria, me parece importante entender essa fé, vou usar a palavra fé no Estado, como ela se articulou historicamente. Então, como que determinada, por exemplo, no meu caso específico, determinada facção da Revolução Mexicana, que não era mais popular, eram os constitucionalistas, por isso que tinha advogado no meio, né, trabalhando isso daí, buscaram, de alguma forma, o quê? Nacionalizar a exploração de recursos naturais. Tinham outras propostas na mesa? É claro que tinham. De facções mais radicais da Revolução Mexicana, por exemplo, né? Mas talvez o resultado, óbvio, seria outro se a gente tivesse uma outra, né? A pesquisa não vai tão longe, Letícia, a ponto de ver quais seriam as outras alternativas, pelo menos nesse momento, né? Eu diria que o objetivo aqui talvez é pensar esse ideal modernista de Estado, né, como o desenvolvedor será a forma política que vai nos tirar da condição de colônia. Porém, o direcionamento me parece ser muito claro, né? Algo que é muito similar aos moldes europeus, porém que nos é inalcançável. Inalcançável porque a gente não tem condição de acumular recursos, né, para usar uma expressão marxista, a acumulação primitiva de recursos que eles tiveram com o colonialismo e que possibilitou uma revolução industrial do jeito como a gente viu e, portanto, o desenvolvimento que a gente vê, né? Esse desenvolvimento é baseado em violência, extrativismo e matança, para dizer o mínimo, né? Então, concordo contigo, tudo isso para dizer, é limitado, me parece sim, muito limitado, mas do ponto de vista da experiência latino-americana, não na ciência política, mas aqui no direito, acho que a gente tem bastante coisa ainda para entender, né, em detalhes como aconteceu. Então, de novo, não se trata de uma como é que você falou, estadolatria, né? Mas entender os detalhes, né? Quais que eram as utopias desses juristas internacionalistas na época? O que estava no horizonte? O que era sair da condição colonial para eles, né? Decolonizar é que não é, com certeza.
Thank you very much for the lecture. So I would like to ask first Professor Okafor. I agree with you on your thoughts about sanctions and the necessity to regulate the sanctions. But does international law offers an effective answer to the persistence of these sanctions? And the other, as we can, I can say also, the answer is not about in politics and this new bipolarity concerning the cold peaks. As we see today, take Russia and China nowadays, and the oil money laundering that is going from Russia through China to India and then everywhere. And so, and take also the example of Syria and now the Arab states that now is joined together and are joined again Syria in the Arab League in the efforts to reconstruct Syria. And these two states, Syria and Russia, are so many targeted in sanctions by the US. But now the balance of power in China or the Arab states, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, now the answer is not about in politics and the multipolarity, and which answers does the international law can offer to regulate this kind of
Posso intervir na sua pergunta? Obi, may I just jump in because I'm dying to ask you this, não? Desculpa, Fabrício, você quer perguntar mais coisa?
Era pra ti. Continua.
Não, termina, vai. Feio.
Não.
Obi, brinca. This is because as I don't have this doer kind of thing, I'm always like, I find this amazing, no? Because it seems that you need to be alert, like 30 hours per day and thinking of strategies, what we're going to do, how we can maybe achieve this and that. It seems like really not super engaged and everything. And much needed. But what I would love to hear from you is if you could give us a few examples. Do you think it's possible to say a priori or beforehand, no, international law won't be able to answer this? Or you, from your even theoretical perspective of international law, you wouldn't be able, no, Fabia, we can't, only the concrete case may be able to offer limitations. So can we, maybe I'm not as hopeful as Karin with the language of law, but do you think, are there any instances where law can actually, we should take a step back and leave it for political struggles, or could we be allies to these movements, something like this? Thank you. Obrigada, Fabrício.
Yeah. Thank you so much for questions. They are indeed related, of course. And I will answer both of them. One a bit more general, the other quite specific, but toward the same point. I think it was either Richard Falk or Burns Weston back in the day who described law, including international law, both of them are international lawyers, as congealed politics. That's the way I understand law. It is also legitimized politics. So in terms of politics here, I cannot hear power, but for me, power in two modes. So there is military, strategic, economic, that kind of power, and there is ideation of power, and they are not completely opposed, right? So that both identity formation can limit strategy. So let's think about the war in Ukraine. Have we imagined that war was happening 100 years ago? Ukraine would be obliterated. There's one reason Ukraine is not obliterated: ideas. You can't use nuclear weapons. That's the only reason. It's not a matched war, but it looks matched partly because of support, but partly because you can't use nuclear weapons. That's an idea, a very powerful idea that hasn't penetrated everybody's brain, but that has penetrated most people. But we see it as but states used to do that all the time, not necessarily nuclear weapons, but use obliterating tactics. You just come, burn it down. The British burned down the headquarters of the Kingdom of Benin. It wasn't anything. Most people haven't even heard of it. It was a kingdom that stretched through 5 countries in West Africa. They just marched in, burnt it and looted all the Benin bronzes and took it to the British Museum. I'm not talking ancient history, 18 something, right? You can't do that now. Ideas, right? So when we talk about the power of law, we have to factor that in. It's not just that we put something as text and write it, and it is part of the contestation for identity formation and ideas. That's what we are contesting. We're trying to shape that. We're trying to limit power. And it's a constant struggle. And sort of material raw power would always win some battles and lose some, right? And it's a kind of dialectic, right, that goes on. And that's why I say we have to begin again, as Fabian said, critical ethnography, to begin to map in detail under what conditions will law have some impact? Under what conditions will it not have in a particular bounded space and time, right? And that helps us to better understand how we can, whether law has a role in X or Y. I started with Fabian because it leads me toward a certain set of tentative answers sorry, we just met. Fabrizio, exactly. Sorry. It's old age that is catching up on me. So Fabio, we may not always, in every case, be able to say a priori if law cannot or cannot provide a solution, but we know for sure there are certain cases where law is not good historically, right, at providing solutions. We know that the high politics, the more central it is to what a state in its identity formation has characterized and it shifts as core to its very existence. And the more power that state has, the less role law is going to have in disciplining that state's behavior on that matter, right? We know that. We may not be able to predict how exactly it might act. It could sometimes revolve on internal contestation, even between the foreign ministry and the Ministry of Defense, right? There are sort of detailed mappings that have shown that, right? Even Chagos. The reason, for example, the U.S. is in Chagos and not in some other island in the Indian Ocean was actually accidental. We'll get into that, right? How power behaved, purely accidental. And somebody who was on decision making told us this just several weeks ago in Philadelphia at the conference, an international affairs academic, but happens, how U.S. academics always working in the government. So there are certain things we know. We also know that national law has been historically very poor at providing solutions to historical injustice.
Yeah.
We know that, right? It's very poor. It doesn't mean it cannot here and there, but it's very poor at providing, including human rights, by the way, to that. It reproduces the whole thing of what happened 300 years ago, 200 years ago. Forget about international law and international human rights reproduce that kind of mentality. So there are certain things we know. We cannot always know, but there are certain things it's not good at doing. So that can help us as a kind of guidepost. In terms of Fabrizio's more specific question of this moment, whether it is law to the rescue or politics, I've already placed law along the continuum of politics, right? So that suggests the answer, right? Which is that I don't see it as a kind of oppositional thing. I believe that law will contribute in some cases, in many cases, including this case. That is why, for example, even in national humanitarian law, you see a lot of contestation around interpretation. Because as bad as many states are, they don't want to be called war criminals. If you want, try one day in the UN and you call the British, for instance, forget the US, the war criminals that they committed crimes against humanity. When the Mauritian Prime Minister suggested this over Chagos, they did forced deportation, which is a war crime. I mean, it's a crime against humanity. The British ambassador went berserk. The notion that Her Majesty's High Representative to the UN is complicit, this is their self-image. That we can commit all these offenses, but we're not war criminals. How dare you? We're not African. Right? That's their image. But it is a war crime to forcibly deport people from their homeland and kill some of them. Especially when you do it on a racist basis, right? But of course, the Russian Prime Minister chooses, but the reaction was just, So states care about those things. And that's why there's a battle over these legal interpretations that seem almost pointless sometimes, can be important, not to yield too much ground. And that's also those who say, all we do is critique. No, it is doing. It is doing. We are contesting self-image. We are problematizing self-image. We are debunking. So what has happened? Since the massive contestation over China, Britain now says, we are going to leave. They said before, we are not going to leave. It's vital to American national interest. Diego Garcia, their main Indian Ocean base and all that. But now, they are recontesting. Wow, we might actually be war criminals if we keep saying this. The ICJ has spoken. Who would have thought that an advisory opinion, not even on a contentious matter, would eventually produce this? And Ukraine helped in a weird way. Because African ambassadors were telling all the time at the UN, you are hypocrites. There's an occupation. Britain, you're occupying the shackles. And you're telling us occupations are bad. It became unsustainable for them. So they now said, okay, let's negotiate, right? And so it's a weird thing. You can never predict it. I would not have predicted that. Philippe Sands revealed this in Philadelphia recently. I would never have predicted that. I thought they were digging, it was vital to their national security, allegedly, and all that. But I was surprised at how sort of they yielded to these mere words on Judge Direito and other judges, right? It's a fascinating thing that I don't have all the answers, but it's just something that really interests me. Under what conditions? Can we specify them? Are they specifiable as you but it's just something that needs more study. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Okafor. Obrigada, professora Fábia. Devido ao horário, a gente vai encerrar esse segundo painel do nosso segundo Seminário Internacional de Direito Internacional Crítico. Gostaria de novamente agradecer a todas e todos por ficarem aqui, por participarem das discussões e por passarem essa sexta-feira conosco pensando um pouco mais criticamente esse ramo do direito que tanto nos encanta. Só uma palavra, amanhã pela manhã então temos workshop, para aqueles que estão inscritos, o workshop será no bloco 3D, Faculdade de Direito, na sala 309, no terceiro andar, às 9 horas. E dito isso, gostaria de novamente agradecer a todos os membros e agezerianos que nos ajudaram a realizar esse evento. Lembrando também que semana que vem temos o nosso evento de migrações na segunda e terça-feira. Caso não estejam ainda inscritos, os convido a fazê-lo. Muito obrigada e uma boa noite a todos e todas.